Ooh, I'm now live. So what could go wrong? I thought I'll do a video, you know, the way you do. And then I realized I've got the washing machine on and the cooker on. And I thought, I can't be bothered taking them off, so never mind. And I'm also drinking this from, this is a store in Ireland. It's weird, this stuff. I was actually given this because the people who bought it didn't like it. So it's coconut water, and it really is just like water with the smidgest little hint of coconut. Yeah, it's really weird. It's kind of like somebody's put a little drop of coconut into water. Anyway, that's not what I'm here for. I'm going to share my screen and see if this works. Share screen. I'm not quite sure what I'm doing. All right, here we go. Yeah, so I was watching this. This is Michelle Lowe from thing. Let's see if we can play this little bit and you can hear it.
I still think there's some useful points. Like I said, this is more of a discussion rather than, you know, endorsing this particular study, but I think there is some really good findings. So just a little bit about the author's rationale for doing this. So veganism is a way of living, as we know, to seek to exclude as far as possible and practicable all forms of exploitation of and cruelty to animals for food, clothing, and any other purpose. That's
right. So that's the way that most people think about veganism, it seems, and we just see this over and over again. Where am I? Stops sharing screen. Okay, no idea if this is going to work, but never done this screeny malarkey before. So yeah, so that's not the definition of veganism. So this video is going to be entitled "Get the Definition Right." I'll turn my phone off as well. Everything's going to go wrong. I just know. So I'm going to share this screen again. What do I do? Oh no, not quite sure what to do here. All right, now, so the definition of veganism. So this is the definition of veganism now. Now, it used to be what Michelle just read out, but they've updated it to include the bit at the beginning that was missing and the bit at the end that was missing. So the first thing, veganism is a philosophy. Okay, that bit was always missed out, and a lot of activists don't include that. Veganism is a radical philosophy about justice for all folks, and luckily now we're back into this thing now where it's actually part of the Vegan Society definition. Also, it wasn't part of the key facts, but I've noticed that they've now put that there as well, so that's good. So veganism is a philosophy, because you know what it's like. If you go to a dictionary definition of veganism, it's all rubbish. I mean, look at this, you know. A strict vegetarian who consumes no food such as meat, eggs, or dairy products that comes from animals. Yep, not very PC, that is it. So I just really wanted to say on this video, let's get the definition right. The Vegan Society have just updated the definition of veganism, and it talks about it being a philosophy. It's much more radical than a lot of modern day activists will have you believe. They tend to have a reducitarian view of veganism. I tend to favor the more radical view of veganism, and at least now we've got a bit more of the radicalism into the definition. Now that definition that I've shown you, even from the Vegan Society, is their 1979 to 1988 definition. A lot of people think it's something to do with Donald Watson. That's not true. And a lot of people think that it's been the definition forever, and that's not true. There is some definitions, or at least statements about veganism from the pioneers of the Vegan Society, which are much better than that. I mean, Donald Watson said in 1945 that veganism was about the opposition of the exploitation of sentient life, whether it's profitable to do so or not, which is much better. Leslie Cross said better things than this fairly kind of weak and washy kind of official definition that we've had. But at least now we can look at the full definition of veganism. So if you see this short one that Michelle read out from a research paper, then be aware that it's not the definition of veganism. It's a reducitarian version. If you see this reducitarian version within the movement, I don't know, from the likes of AV perhaps, think about why they're giving you this slimmed down version of veganism. Why is it that they prefer this limited view of veganism rather than the expansive philosophical view, which is much more radical? Think about why they're doing that, because there is a story behind that, and that's an interesting one in itself. So since my spin cycle has started and I've still got loads of coconut water to consume, I'm gonna say no. I'm gonna say goodbye. So yeah, total chaos. So goodbye, Earthlings. See you later. Suggests that, you know, when groups get big and professional and all that, they start to
Welcome. We are live again for another debate with Hetz and Yates. This is our second edition. We had so much fun the first one, we decided might as well crack on and try it again.
Yeah, we just got a message saying that we're down for 4 p.m., not 3 p.m., but it's 3 p.m., folks, because here we are doing it.
Yeah, maybe there's a time zone thing going on there. Maybe in Europe it might come up as 4. I'm not sure. But yeah, with that, I think the topic for today was a bit, we had some late hour decisions. We had a whole topic planned and ready to go. And the lesson for today, if you get nothing else from the video, is to vet your potential content, because you might find some surprises.
Honest, so it's a good job that you did, because we were well into the plan for this, weren't we?
Oh, it was a lengthy debate that we all broken down. I had all these great points to make, but I'm sure the due diligence will, you know, the ideas from now will come back eventually. But it looks like we have 8 people with this, so go ahead and let us know. You're here in the comments. Hello, Vegan Potterhead and Nikki. And I think maybe, I mean, these things are a bit loose compared to a normal formal debate setting, but I think it's only fair we both kind of frame where we come at from this thing and see where we're similar and where we're different. So for this week's topic, we are going to be discussing national groups and the grassroots.
Oh, I thought we were doing that video, Jeremy.
Well, we still can if you want to. We got it all ready to go.
No. Please, whatever you do, don't put that up on there. That was 2 days' work down the drain. That was, wasn't
it? I'm sure people could associate with that. Hello, Elliot and Corey. Nice of you to join us. And Nella. Yeah, so I guess I know those who follow your work will be quite familiar with your kind of positioning, that, you know, obviously I think we're both in favor of finding ways to evolve and develop the grassroots. So perhaps, I mean, there's probably more similarities there. And then from a national group perspective, I mean, well, maybe we start there. What role do you think the national groups play?
Yeah, I think you're right. We're both going to agree on that we want a thriving grassroots, but we're probably going to disagree on what the kind of national groups kind of do to that kind of aspiration, I suppose. And in some ways, I've always thought that the national groups end up being a bit of a block. And I see Corey's here. Hi, Corey. And, you know, even social movement theory kind of suggests that, you know, when groups get big and professional and all that, they start to moderate and be much more careful, and the radical edge of a movement starts to get chipped away at. And so this is what we've seen really in the movement, you know. But I mean, in terms of my kind of understanding of what we're talking about and the issue goes back to the 1970s. In fact, when I first started to get involved in 1977 with the Hunt Saboteurs and stuff, or tried to at least, it coincided with a kind of scandal involving the RSPCA to do with the embezzlement or the kind of misuse of money. And then when I was involved, which was like in the 1980s, so we're talking about 1980, 1981, we tried to have the Queen removed from the RSPCA. So a lot of people joined the RSPCA so they could go to the AGM, and we tried to get the Queen removed, which was voted for. And then there was a lunch break, and then we got told when we came back in the afternoon that the Queen had been reinstated by the board. And so so I was starting to think, okay, you know, what's going on with these big rich groups kind of thing. Then we had in 1981/82 the radicalization of the BWV. Now the BWV stands for British Union for the Abolition of Vivisection, which doesn't exist anymore. I believe it's now called Cruelty Free International. But when it was radicalized, it meant it was kind of taken over by much more radical people than had hitherto run the thing. In fact, there was lots of kind of animal welfare things and stuff in the office when we went in there. And one of the first things that they did was, because I was part and parcel of this, I remember Charing Cross in London, they made some "This is Vivisection" fly posters, which are really big vivisection things. One with a cat and one with a monkey. This is Vivisection. And we basically wrapped them up, rolled them up, and sent them out to just about anybody we could think of. You know, the Stabs, anybody involved with early Sea Shepherd, all that kind of stuff. They just sent them out. And then all these fly posters went up all over the place. And also Animal Aid were doing some stuff on the local level too at the time. And so it was kind of that time when I realized the potential of the grassroots being given to access to some funds, because the way it used to work once the BWV was radicalized wasn't the case with Animal Aid. It was with the NAVs afterwards, which is the National Anti-Vivisection Group, is that if you kind of knew the people who were running these big groups, you could kind of not necessarily get a backhander, but you could get some funds. And then so I realized, well, okay, well, if the benefit of getting funds in the grassroots was so good, which it was, then if we were able to do that across the board, how could we would really be able to develop the grassroots? And I think that's where we're kind of at the moment. You know, Ronnie Lee and I are both interested in this idea that if we can develop and empower the grassroots, we would develop the movement. And this is the age of the internet. You know, I mean, I tend to think that the national group system is counter-revolutionary. That's how I would characterize it. Because
and if I can stop you there, by revolutionary, what how would you frame revolutionary?
Well, I'm really talking about DIY politics and DIY culture, and so we're talking about bringing about. Well, you see, I think vegan animal rights is a revolutionary idea. You know, it's got massive ramifications for society and for the planet even, and so it's a revolutionary idea, and that's reflected in the views of the pioneers of the vegan movement as well. And so once you kind of feed that radicalism through a national group system, it kind of gets diluted. Whereas if it stays on the grassroots footing, it remains much more kind of radical and also dynamic. You know,
and that's to cater to donors, I guess. The whole theory being that to make the donor base happy, the message is more universally appealing, and by doing so, it's automatically going to de-radicalize it. It's going to reduce it. We're going to slip into welfare and reducitarianism and all those types of topics. Is that kind of what you're a bit of what you're talking about?
Yeah. Social movement theory would say that, you know, once you start getting things like offices and, you know, the other way of office, you know, so you get an office, but also you get officers like, you know, like press officers, that kind of stuff. Then, you know, you start to get professionalized, and then people start to think in terms of their cause being a career. And so there's always a problem there. And it's not just restricted to the animal movement by any means. It kind of goes kind of across the board. And we certainly have seen, you know, that phenomena in the animal movement, where once you start to professionalize and, you know, you get yourself into this kind of, you know, arena of professionalism, P45s, jobs, wages, and all this kind of stuff, it changes the movement. It just changes the ethos of a movement, and it de-radicalizes itself, because you're kind of having to first and foremost think about keeping the organization running. And in fact, in sociology, it's often said that, you know, people who are once radical end up running jumble sales in order to raise funds, you know, and so it kind of takes the edge off it. That's what I'd argue.
Because on the surface, it seems like a good thing, right? If we could pay animal advocates to do things more full time, and they're not distracted by the, you know, their day jobs, as it were. But yeah, like you say, that's a huge risk. So maybe it's a balancing act. Corey had a clarification up on the screen now to tell more about the, you know, why so strongly advocates remove the queen.
Why did we advocate? Oh, it was just the fact that she went hunting and stuff, and so she was a patron of the RSPCA, and of course it's interesting really because this was like before Francione, and so just as it isn't, I mean, there's been a regression now. People, you see this in the movement now. If the RSPCA do something outrageous, and you know, certify these eggs as humane and this kind of stuff, people are kind of outraged by it, but that's because they don't understand that it's a traditional animal welfare group. And so you know, it's no surprise that they would endorse free range farming, for example, you know, following people like even Singer and stuff. So that's not a surprise. They're a traditional animal group, and they've never pretended to be anything else. But at the time, there was outrage because the patron used to go hunting. So it wasn't really kind of, oh, you know, the queen eats meat or anything like that. You know, the queen likes a dairy yogurt. It was the fact that she went hunting, and so they thought, okay, well, it'd be a political statement to get her kicked out, because also there's big fights going on in the RSPCA at the time. And in fact, I think there's quite a lot of that in the animals film, if I remember right. You know, people like Dick Corse were involved. Dick Corse used to be the kind of the prime mover of the League Against Cruel Sports, and there was the kind of old guard of the RSPCA and the radical. In fact, there used to be something called the RSPCA.
Elliot's onto it with the C word.
What?
Elliot's onto it. You mentioned the C word, one of your favorite words.
Yes, I love it.
And just a quick clarification, this is separate to our main shows we do on Sunday. This is a bit ad hoc, usually planned with about 12 hours in advance. So it's a bit more of a piecemeal, but the full cast will be back together again on Sunday for more of a structured show. But this is more of a detailed deep dive into the grassroots and national campaign. So it sounds like what you're saying is we need to direct, it seems like your focus is directing funds to the grassroots. However, at the same time, not almost too concentrated. It's more bottom up versus top down. It sounds like that you want to have it spread throughout, which I guess anytime you have a central place to donate funds, you're at risk of them overly controlling them, aren't you? So, you know, if they're not equitably distributing them, you know, how do you stop that?
Yeah. I think that's right. I mean, I would just say, in terms of what you said originally, that, you know, to pretend that we've got a structured show on a Sunday is going a bit too far.
Well, that's a fair point. Well, it's more structured than this. It's all relative, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. No, there is a lot of planning that goes into it, folks. There is actually. So, you know, there's two.
And there's a lot. Real quickly, there's a lot of comments about the U.S. election going on. So we've got some competition going on here. I'm sure there's lots on the YouTube feeds about that going on. So we've got to be more engaging than that. So we'll see if we can match pace. Well, I'll just interrupt you constantly, and we'll have a good presidential debate going on.
I'm going to say, if we're going to role play, you could be Trump. I'm not going to be Trump. I'll tell you that.
We'll draw straws.
So. Yeah, there's two sides of the story for me, I think, in the sense that there's the benefit of developing and empowering the grassroots, and then there's the effect that a national group system has. I mean, for example, when I first started thinking about this, which is the 1980s, and there was this group called the Federation of Local Animal Rights Groups set up. It's now called the Federation of Vegan Local Animal Rights Groups, and there was like 5 anti-vivisection groups at the time. So there was 3 in England and 2 in Scotland. And they were all kind of duplicating each other's work. They all had officers, physical officers. They all had sales goods. They all had people who were employed to give them out. They all had CEOs and all the rest of it, and press officers and all that. And so the amount of wasted money through duplication was huge. And I've always said that if you got all the national group people lined up with the name of their job and the amount of money that they get paid, and I'm not opposed to money, I must clarify that. We will be shocked by the amount of waste, you know. And the argument against that is that, well, if you give money to the grassroots, a lot of money is going to be wasted, which is definitely a risk, and we could talk about that perhaps. But certainly in terms of the way, there is a lot of waste, and there's more national groups and more people who are waged now in the movement than ever before. You know, there are absolutely huge amounts. Now, if that money, rather than being held in these elite power centers, you know, the power elite of the movement, if that was distributed, we would have loads and loads of funds to develop and empower and embolden the grassroots. And there's saboteurs, you know, I mean, how many times have we seen, you know, the hunt saboteurs, they're scratching around to get themselves a Land Rover fixed. That shouldn't happen. We're a relatively rich movement. I know that we're not rich compared with our opponents. I understand that, but that's not relevant to this point. We are relatively rich. And it's just that I don't understand. You see, I'm in Ireland, right? And I know that there's going to be quite a lot of Viva and animal aid type members in Ireland. Well, what that means to me is that their money is flying over the Irish Sea to Kent, you know, and London, away from Dublin and Galway and Limerick and Cork, where it's needed. And I've never understood why people would choose to do that, choose to kind of export the money. I do understand the reasons why people say they do it, and they've said it for years and years and years. And it's to do with things like thinking of the people in the national groups as the professionals, the experts, and this kind of stuff. And I think that's the kind of image. I don't think it bears scrutiny in the sense that there's a lot of, apart from the kind of people right at the top, there's a lot of staff that is kind of moving. Or, you know, people come in from university for a couple of years and then they go and everything. And, you know, there's a lot of young people in the national groups, and they don't know that much, you know, compared with some of the, you know, longer tooth people, if you like, in the grassroots even. So, you know, the idea that, well, we give money to them because they are the experts, that doesn't really hold water for me.
Well, and Corey's got a great comment maybe you can respond to here. Is an interesting case study is the Vegan Feminist Faction. I don't know what your familiarity is with that, but they really advocated for community-based advocacy, critical of hierarchy, celebrity, big leadership, etc., and yet eventually pushed to go national. It failed. They folded after 20 years of running local chapters. Because that's the big thing. It's like human nature, isn't it? I mean, we've all got competing interests. I mean, financial is certainly one of them. It sounds to me like you're saying, well, maybe would you like to reply to Corey's comment before I go off on a tangent? Yeah.
Yes, please, I would. My sister, my sister is well, she was. I'm not quite. She still is, but she was. You would call her a radical separatist feminist. In fact, at one point, I was the only male who was allowed in her house. In fact, the police came to arrest me once, and I was in the house, and she sent them off to get some female officers in order to do it. And so, but she was involved in the Leeds and Bradford area of West Yorkshire, and they had like a female-only yellow pages or golden pages. This kind of, you know, directory. This is before the internet. Directory of people who could do stuff. And so you had female plumbers and female electricians. This was all organized within the grassroots, and it was all local based. It was all kind of very kind of radicalizing. It was all enabling, and it just seemed to kind of go, well, you know, we need this. Let's organize it on this local level. And in terms of doing something like that, you probably wouldn't need any money. But one thing that has always upset me, and I really genuinely mean upset, because I've seen people, and even now, you know, they're stood there with their one fold-down table and a couple of banners and everything. And their dreams of doing this, that, or the other are always squashed down because they can't afford to do it. I've been in meetings over the years where you go, hey, wouldn't it be great to have this, and wouldn't it be great to do this, and then they go, yeah, but we can't afford it, right?
Do you think the GoFundMe campaigns have helped with that? Because I know that's something a lot of local communities have done, and maybe if there's anybody watching that's had success fundraising in your local area, you could chuck that in there. Because to me, I think that's the key is finding ways to access the funds ourselves.
Yeah,
but literally just starting a GoFundMe campaign saying, here's this great idea. And then hopefully we can get people to get excited about it and you know.
Yeah, I tend to think that I've always thought that to get the big bucks into the grassroots, you need to transfer it from the kind of power and money centers of the movement. And but you could do it that way. I mean, if people were convinced that it would be more profitable in terms of the movement or the cause, it'd be more profitable for them to donate to the grassroots, and then we had a structure by which they could do it, which is something that's been worked on, rather than you know, renewing their subscription to several national groups. Well, maybe that would work. In the age before the internet, we actually tried to take over a few national groups in order to disband them and give their money away. That was the plan. In fact, they even took us to court to stop us doing it and stuff.
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a few different questions floating around out there. I mean, I think we're just dancing around probably one of the key, I guess, if I may say, I think probably one of the key things we see a bit differently, because my perspective would be help give the grassroots the tools necessary to raise funds on their own. Whereas it sounds like from your perspective, it's more about moving away from the national group model. Whereas my thought is let them do their thing and we can do ours. Do you think that's a fair synopsis? I mean, I appreciate some of this is conversations that led up to this, not that necessarily this conversation specifically, but.
Well, I think you make a reasonable point, you know, but I mean, I always respond by saying things like, you know, this is the age of the internet. And I want somebody to say, and I'm excluding, I'm bracketing off the vegan society in this respect, but what do these national corporations do in the age of the internet that the grassroots can't do? And nobody can answer that, in the sense that I know that there are still a lot of people in Britain, breaks my heart this, who are still beholden to the national groups because they make good leaflets and they like to give away their shiny leaflets. Well, as though we can't do the leaflets and we can't organize a way of doing leaflets and, you know, sending templates to get printed out. And the best thing about that, you see, the point is, when you give out a national group leaflet, you're actually doing free labor for them, because it's their logos and it's their kind of details, and it goes back to them and all that. Another thing we ought to talk about is legacies, but I mean, maybe we could come back to that, but that is an important point within this discussion that we ought to talk about.
Yeah, and welcome to everybody who's been joining us. I see Sam and Jennifer's also joined us, and Corey's got a good response to the point I just raised, is that, you know, if we just leave the national groups to do their thing, that they're actually a bit of resistance. And the thing I would add to that, I mean, expanding on the radical activism front, I mean, that is a big concern of mine, because I think one thing we've been trying to do with the Animal Rights Show is bring back animal rights, but really just, to me, it's quite simple, shifting the focus back to ending use versus improving treatment, which the movement is rife with, whether we know it or not, through our language. So I do think the national groups have a lot to answer for as far as pushing that welfare-driven message. I don't know if we have the capability to do what we're talking about here. Is the other thing, you know, if we're going to focus our efforts on that versus actually getting on with it, I don't know how that would even transpire. But
going back to Corey's point, I remember being, I'm not going to name any names, I remember being in the office of one national group where they were on the phone to the office of another national group, telling them to stop attacking the ALF, because there was a sea change in the movement, where because the homes had started to dry up, then the actual physical liberation of other animals started to lessen, and the amount of economic damage started to rise. And that scared some of the national groups, who was hitherto fairly cautiously supportive, let's say, of the direct action thing. And then when there was a change, it meant that, you know, the press were asking them difficult questions and everything. And so they started, in fact, to join in with calling the activists terrorists and stuff like this. And until they all started doing that, there was quite a lot of discourse and dialogue between them by the ones who kind of like were the last to kind of give it up, as it were, you know. And that, you know, this had really serious ramifications for the movement, but it's not relevant to this thing, but it's relevant to Corey's point there.
Yeah, and just building on with that is because one of the, you know, simple answers, or at least on the surface appears to be, is for the national groups that help support the grassroots and you know, some of those big ideas you're talking about that you know, local activists can't do because they don't have the funds, all of a sudden getting some funding from the national groups. But I think to Corey's point, that's could be a bit of a Trojan horse. I'm not sure if it's speciesist for me to say Trojan horse or not, but you know, it seems like a good thing on the surface. But if all of a sudden, like to your point earlier, if we're using their leaflets and their this, that, and the other, we're actually kind of doing their labor.
Jeremy, Trojan horses made out of wood, aren't they?
It's about the symbolism in our language, Roger. You know this. Come on. Cultural speciesism. Come on.
I think the idea to cut the umbilical cord between the national groups and the local groups would, if you like, give the local groups their head to really develop in the way that they want. It's very kind of liberating in that sense, that you actually we need a structure where you go, you know, you've got some ideas, you know, where we can help you, kind of thing. You know, we can fund that, and you know, that to me would be very liberating, because people then would see, in the way that we are seeing now because of social media, you know, one group can see that, you know, you see the type of videos that one group people on this call check in with the national groups and see what they're doing, compared with checking in, you know, with some of the entrepreneurs or other stuff that's going on. You know, they're almost like you know, peripheral, and yet we've got money centers in the movement. That's the thing that worries me, because of all kind of reasons. As soon as money gets involved, then you've always got a problem, because that's when you start to get people behaving maybe in ways that are not necessarily the best for the movement or the cause. I mean, this is a personal opinion, obviously.
Yeah, well, and I think that's the whole thing. I think we generally try to do these things for about an hour, and we're obviously not going to address all the questions here, but I think the important thing is that we're having the discussions. Kevin raises a great point about the GoFundMes. Yeah, that basically still an issue of multinational and national groups that aren't just after funds from big philanthropists, but also go after the general movement to donate to effective organizations. Politically, the civilians need to be given more standing alongside the nonprofit professionals. So, and that's kind of like the whole activism by proxy, isn't it? You know, if we mail in our $5 once a month, or, you know, is that job done? Kind of that you know, perspective as well. And we need to be multi-dimensional in our activism, don't we? You know, it's not just about sending off a check once a month. It's about more than that. But
yeah, that is, yeah. In fact, I saw a national group did this. I've not seen this since, oh God, the 80s. Give us a donation to help us to help them. We used to get that a lot in leaflets, and I actually saw an organization do that recently. I thought, wow, you know, I mean, rather than go do, you know, if there's an issue, you know, go sort it out and we'll help, type of thing. You know, with the grassroots kind of ethos, if you like. It was more like give us the money and we'll do it for you. You can then sit back thinking, well, I've done my job. You know, let's get back to Netflix. That's not revolutionary. You know, going back to Kevin's point, just for clarification for people, because there's a bit of coded language in there, especially the last sentence. That comes from the vegan strategist Tobias Lennart. He talked about people being the paid people in the movement, being the professionals, and he called the grassroots civilians in the movement. And that's the way that they see us. They see us as lesser than. We're the civilians, they're the professionals, the experts. And it's kind of really what's needed is for us to behave ourselves give out their leaflets, support their events, and give them the money, and they'll do the job. That's not revolutionary.
More competition versus collaboration, it sounds like.
Well, it's just that it's their way of thinking about us. The grassroots are not the movers and shakers. The grassroots are just the kind of cannon fodder, but the people who would create the funds. And then, of course, we've got the relatively new phenomenon now, because when the federation started, we were talking about just people giving donations in. I mean, just to illustrate that, when I was in Liverpool, and then in 1982, I went to the BOAV on their executive committee, and I felt really, really guilty because I used to have to claim £12.50 for expenses for the coach. I would go on the coach because it's cheaper than the train, and I would do that. And the reason for that is that when we were in Liverpool doing our stall, which we did about three times a week in those days, there was this little old lady who came up, and she's bound to be dead now. She was really old then. This is the 80s. And she would give us a quid, which is a lot of money in those days for a pensioner. And she'd go, "This is terrible, isn't it?" And then a couple of months later, you'd see her again. "Oh, is this still happening? Isn't it terrible?" And when I used to go to the BOAV every month for the committee meetings, I would think, well, my expenses is 12.5 of these little old ladies giving you a quid. So money meant something to me. I mean, we're not talking about getting $12,000 a month on Patreon in those days. The money gets sucked into power centers and the power elite of the movement, and I've always been opposed to it, and I've always been very wary of it, and I always think it disempowers us. I still do, obviously.
It's a balance on multiple levels, isn't it? Because you need the funds, but you also don't want the funds to change our advocacy. Just another point from Corey here. Nick Cooney once blogged for Animal Charity Evaluators in a piece meant for uni students, arguing that the best way to help animals was to get a good job paying and then donate more to big groups, such as an incredible missed opportunity and such evidence of the neoliberalization of our movement. And that's kind of the earn to give, if I'm interpreting that correctly, that earn to give philosophy. I mean, what's your take on the earn to give idea? I mean, do you think if the money was able to funnel to the right places, that there could actually be something to be said for that, for people that are high earners to actually focus on that, and that's their advocacy? Or do you think it's a bit of a distraction from radical movement?
What was that concept called again, you said?
Earn to give. So the whole idea is that if you're an exceptionally high earner, that you can give far more funds to support the movement rather than being on the ground, as it were.
Yeah, okay, but I mean, we're into that thing about.
I'm sensing a bit of hesitation.
No, but I mean,
I'm not saying I agree with it for what it's worth. I'm just putting it out there. Yeah.
You know what it's like. Essentially, if you're rich enough, giving money away is in your financial interest, and that's the kind of reason why a lot of that kind of goes on. But that's the kind of new phenomena. I mean, obviously, funds coming from anywhere is one thing, but I think we ought to be very wary about where it comes from, even though, of course, money from anywhere is useful. But there's obviously got to be thought about that, and especially if the strings attached. I mean, we've seen a recent kind of example of where a big donor has started to kind of stir the waters because something was happening that he didn't like, and apparently this guy is a he. And it's caused ruptions in the movement, and so I would prefer just for people, ordinary people in ordinary jobs, just giving their subscriptions, but to the grassroots. That's how I've always thought about it. This kind of new entrepreneur thing, this new kind of venture capitalists and all that. I'm very wary about that because of what they are and who they are.
And I see a few new additions. My mom's just joined us, and looks like the Crank's in the house, who has a point about Nick Cooney using the money to sue women who spoke up about him preying on them. So that's certainly not where we want funds to go. And I think that's it. When we have I think that's it, isn't it? Because if we have these power centers, like you say, where all this money is collecting, it's unlikely, it's increasingly less likely that that money is going to be furthering the cause of animal liberation. It's going to be, building retirement accounts. Yeah, so I guess from an efficiency perspective, I think you made the point earlier, if I can try to dial in a bit, would you say that the grassroots is more efficient with funds?
No.
So, okay, it's just that if we can distribute the money, it can be, I guess, more directly used.
I mean,
the thing is, it needs to be dispersed widely, and there needs to be some level. I was a auditor in a past life, so there needs to be some level of financial controls to make sure that there's not, there's adequate oversight over the distribution, I guess.
Yeah, well, the thing is, the grassroots are cheap compared as well. I mean, the projects that the grassroots come up with, they would probably need a kind of stream of funding. And so in that sense, there could be an element of control, kind of democratically arranged control, if you like. And, so if there was a kind of fund that could be developed, there would obviously have to be a way for people to apply to it, and then for the stream to be set off in their direction. But there'd have to be checks and balances, because there are going to be some people who go, oh, this is good, and they pocket the money and they bugger off. Because, I mean, we even had that in Ireland, I mean, Declan Bowen's, his group is called VEGO, Vegan Education on the Go. And the reason that he called it that was because he wanted veganism and vegan education to spread all over the country. And so that's why he called it that. And he wanted to enable that. And he's given, posters that he's made personally and all that, and bought fold down tables for people and all that. And, we're not necessarily sure where they ended up. But so there's gonna be some problems, but don't get fooled by thinking that the national groups are efficient. I mean, I've known national groups, they update their computer system and buy all the wrong ones and waste thousands and thousands. So sure, there's a risk with funding the grassroots, but because they're cheaper, you're not kind of taking as many risks, you'd think. And also you'd have to work out a way of controlling that. I mean, I know that doesn't sound too revolutionary itself, but you'd have to do it. Otherwise it would just be an open tap then. And obviously that wouldn't be any good.
It's delicate balance, isn't it? Because we almost need a structure in between the national groups and the grassroots, because we do need some level of centralization, just maybe without the rigid controls. So we need to have, minimize as much as possible the duplication, but then still have the local groups have the flexibility to do what they want to do.
Yeah, but we're in the age of the internet. There's no reason why we can't have representatives of the groups. I mean, they could organize locally, then they could organize regionally if they wanted to. The regionals could then have representatives. We could probably organize a democratic structure where people would have their say, and because it's not based on a kind of power hierarchy, it's based on the entire idea is to aid the cause. Because this is a problem sometimes. Going back to the BUAV, I used to know a couple of the BUAV committee people. Used to think the letters BUAV were kind of magical, and in fact, I seem to remember. I think they were sued by the Boots at one time, and they were ordered to give them a few tens of thousands of pounds. And I remember Ronnie Lee saying, in that case, the BUAV should just fold, just collapse itself, disband, in order not to pay that, because Boots were vivisectors, right? And I remember Ronnie saying, I would fold the ALF in a second if it was good for the movement. That's the ethos that we need.
True, it is a very different mindset. And Jake just asked a clarifying question around if there's some value to grassroots folks taking power within the nationals. What are your thoughts around that? I mean, the BUAV's been mentioned, but do you think there's something to be said for that? I mean,
well, that's what kind of happened during the radicalization of the BUAV, but then it became clear that probably the more radical thing to do would be to take it over in order to destroy it. which I know sounds destructive, but it's actually very creative, because the idea then is to spread that around into the grassroots. I mean, in those days, you know, we were all involved with some forms of direct action, you know, the NAL and all this kind of stuff, and hunt saboteurs were all sabbing and all this kind of stuff. I mean, I remember in Liverpool, there was Dave Callender working until 4 in the morning on reports for the HSA, and he had a battered old Volkswagen Beetle, you know, kind of Herbie car, you know, little old blue car, and we were fighting all the time to keep it on the road, you know, and yet the guy did so much. You know, he organised the Waterloo Cup thing, he organised the grouse shooting in the north. He was, you know, and another thing that's important, I think, is probably thinking in terms of, you know, a lot of new vegans don't know this, but the idea of full-time activists is not new. If you think back to, when is it, Jeremy, in the 80s?
In the 80s, I don't have a clip for that one yet, so I'll spare you.
If we think back to those times, there was more full-time activists then than there is now. It's just that they weren't taking wages out of the movement, and they weren't superstars, and they weren't. In fact, most of them used to wear masks, not so they could stand in the queue, it's so the police couldn't recognize them. And so it was a different time back then. You know, I myself had several false names, including quite a few female names. You know, Sarah Dean and Jill Lockwood and all this. And it was because we didn't have any desire to become famous. I remember a conversation I had with Ronnie, and we said, you know, it's funny, isn't it? You know, we never thought about becoming rich via the movement, you know.
Well, that's it, because we've talked about this before, haven't we? Because just because the money's coming in doesn't mean there's not some underlying good motivation there. It's just, I think the theme we keep coming back to is the money corrupts, both at a group level and an individual level, or at least it has a strong potential to do so. Maybe not universally, but it certainly seems like a risk we need to be aware of. Yeah, some more comments coming in. I mean, just because it sounds like we need some level of centralization. Talking about Nikki's talking about getting a big office space and printers and so forth. Because I mean, I think if we leave it to the local level to come up with their own materials, as you were talking about, we've got to have some level of working together. Otherwise, it's kind of time prohibitive to actually, you know, for local groups to get out there. And I think the big thing that we keep coming back to is just the lack of organizers.
Well, yeah, but that goes back to the federation in the early days. I'm not going to say the number again. In the early days, where before the age of the internet, we were thinking that we would have to kind of get together and draw up loads of leaflets that covered all the single issues that everyone was doing at the time. And instead of, you know, essentially doing the same job in leaflet form as all the national groups were doing, so anti-vivisection stuff, anti-bullfighting, whatever it was, anti-circus stuff, all the things, and you would have these leaflets, but you would leave a space, right? And the idea was to send them out to all the local groups, and they would either be able to buy stickers or one of these rubber stamp things and stamp their own details on it, so it became their leaflet. Now, in the age of the internet, it's even easier. You just centrally organize some leaflets, and you can just send them out, and then the local groups can either print them out. I mean, like Vigo and VIP, all our leaflets have been done with a it's over there in my room. It's just a photocopier, and Vigo leaflets have been a photocopier. The idea that you need to have these big, fancy, shiny leaflets, which are probably bad for the environment, by the way, compared with having zine style, or just, I mean, people, you know, I mean, I've got film of people, they come up, there's Go Vegan World stuff, all nice and shiny. There's the other stuff, which is just photocopied, and they're just taking the stuff that looks interesting. They don't give a monkeys about whether it's shiny or not, and looking professional, all that bullshit. You see, that's just mythology, I think, in the movement, that it's got.
Well,
you know.
I think I'll push back a little bit on that, because I think if we frame this as a debate, we can't agree too much. Well, I mean, I think if we just, you know, we're tearing pieces of paper in half and writing a website on it, that's going to have a different uptake. You know, obviously it doesn't change the moral question. I think we all know that, but I do think that having a designed I'm more of a fan of more of a closing card or, you know, the business card shape versus leaflets, because I think they're less likely to be put in someone's pocket and more likely to go in the bin, which to your point isn't great from an environmental perspective. But
yeah, but I'm not talking about ripping a piece of paper in half and scribbling on it, Jeremy. I'm talking about you have a proper design. I mean, the VIP have got proper design, you know, three-fold leaflets.
Sure.
It's just
sure,
that we printed them out on the photocopier, and we also did a deal with the photocopier thing where we got the ink free. So we're really kind of, you know, reducing the costs. You know,
I think there's a point of diminishing returns. I think some thought about the presentation is important, but yeah, to your point, there is, yeah, it reaches a point where it's a bit superfluous, I think, and perhaps a waste of funds. There's got to be some centralization, though. I think is that maybe a lesson we could take a little bit from some of these groups that, you know, that are starting to scale up, but it seems like we hit a certain point. You know, Corey's point earlier, talking about a group that was 20 years in before it failed. I mean, we'd be lucky to make it to 20 years, I think, as a group. You know, for a lot of the groups in the animal movement right now. But I mean, it seems like we keep
the show then for a minute.
Well, coincidentally, this Sunday is our 20th. We don't count these towards the count, but is our 20th show. So if you want to join the Animal Rights Show for the 20th edition this Sunday, 20% of the way to 100, right?
Yeah, folks, I've tolerated Jeremy Hess for 20 shows.
You beat me to it. Tolerated myself.
I knew you were going to do that, so I thought I'd get in there first. Yeah.
Got to be quick.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough one for me because I think the comment you made earlier around we could liberate ourselves if we were less focused on these national organizations. I think there's definitely something to that. However, I also think there's a risk associated with that while some may be liberated, some may benefit from that guidance. And I'm not necessarily framing it that the national organizations are where they get their guidance from, but I think in general, local groups need some level of guidance and support to organize.
This is the age of the internet, though, Jeremy. You can get guidance. You just have to put it on the internet, and you'll get millions of people talking to you within an hour. So what's the problem?
It's highly unstructured, though, right? Like, let's just say, I mean, I think we're both a bit advantaged that you're in Dublin, I'm in Brighton, both have huge activism scenes, several different groups, all, you know, working hopefully together on some level, lots of different things. You know, it's a buffet of what kind of activism you want to get involved in. But for you, let's just say you're the only vegan in the village, so to speak, and you want to start doing, I mean, focusing on street work. Obviously, there's lots of different forms. How do they get, you know, they go on the internet, they go to a Facebook page, you know, I mean, where do they go to get this information? That's so, well, you know, actually, I push back on it being so simple.
Funny enough. I want you to explain to me what centralization means in a minute, but I'm going to do a film with Declan Bones because he started Vigo about 7 years ago. It might have been going before that, but he actually started on his street work about 7 years ago. And it was just a little fold-down table, and he kind of put it out on a Facebook group that he was going to be there. And I think on the first week, nobody turned up. So he did it on his own. And then the second week, an English woman turned up, and they did it together. And then they had some ideas about, oh, should we get some leaflets, or maybe, you know, because they had some railings behind them, should we get some who can hang on? And so they developed. And now they've probably got physically the biggest street outreach thing in the world now. It's absolutely huge. It takes you a minute to walk past it. It's so big. You know, somebody said in the banner, in the comments, I think it was Nikki, I think.
I just popped it up there, yeah.
Yeah, we need banners. Well, we've got 12 banners, these roll-up banners. And, you know, they're kind of 8 foot tall and, you know, 4 foot wide and all that. They're very, very effective. But also, you know, you need to keep updating them. You need the funds. Declan's got lots and lots of kind of double A3 big huge posters which we hang up. And you know, they get water damage because he makes them himself. You know, even down to, you know, you put all that sticky back plastic on it and all that and do all that. But if they were made by the local printer, they would last for years. You know, and you know, just needs a bit more money. You know, give Vigo just $20,000, pounds, euros a year. That would massively improve what they do. You know, I mean, people are getting that per week.
Yeah, well, and just on a side point on leaflets, this is a good tactic, I guess, that for the rights-based advocates out there, which hopefully a lot of the fans of the show are, is that actually selectively taking parts of the leaflets that you agree with and maybe losing the parts that you don't. To Corey's point about specifically taking off the back page that had the welfarist message, which, yeah, it'd be hard to find which bits to keep and which to lose these days, I think. But
oh, we used to cut the bits off leaflets that we didn't like.
So it looks like a
I mean,
all these little bits missing.
I mean, the thing that changed.
Use it as a decoder ring. You hold it up to a newspaper, and it has a secret message. If you look through all the holes, is that how it?
You know, there was one time when the local groups had to pay the national groups for their leaflets, and it was pretty expensive as well. For the privilege of keeping them rich and the power elite of the movement, you had to pay them to get their leaflets off them. Obviously, the internet and all that changed all that, and now, oh, isn't it wonderful? You see comments. Isn't it wonderful? You can get this national group to give you leaflets free. Well, of course, it's their advertising. You're providing free labor for them. Of course, they're going to give you it free nowadays.
Well, and I think just to provide a bit more color to that, I think when you're not kind of tuned into the rights-based side of things and you're not seeing, I mean, we trade messages all the time, don't we, about all these welfare messages jumping out, I think if you're not tuned into that, the idea of getting the leaflets just mailed to you can be quite appealing. But I think once you start to look into the messaging, I mean, Human Love Solidarity here said, making the communication simple and short, with using new vocabulary and narrative with an emphasis on a better future. I mean, I think once you start tuning into the messaging, internally and having those discussions, it's possibly less prone to doing that. But on the surface, I think that, if we could change the messaging, I think there's something to be said for that, because they are providing a service. If you're just going on the street by yourself and you don't have the funds to just have the leaflets ready to go, could be seen as a good thing.
Yeah, we need more leaflets with "Have mercy for animals" written on it.
I don't have the logo ready to go with your head exploding. We really do. Well, and I think
Nikki says not everybody is technologically minded, okay, and can use help. Well, yeah, but that's the idea, is to provide that help. It's almost like a Challenge 22 for activists and for organizers. The idea would be, to help people. One group would say, well, we got around that problem by doing this. It wouldn't be hard in the age of the internet, Zoom calls and all that, just to get a group of people together who are organizers and say, well, how did you do it? Well, how did you do it? Well, how did you do it? And then people go, oh, I never thought of that before. And oh, well, I didn't think of it that way. We could solve this problem. It wouldn't be. This is the age of the internet. We've got global mass community. We're the first group of activists to have this, folks. We've got instant global mass communication. We can talk to the world. We are, in theory. Now, we can do that.
I think we have the tool, but I would push back that it's not sharpened. I don't think we have the communication channels that are. Maybe I'm getting a bit metaphorical. It's not. Back to my earlier question. If someone's looking to do their first street event, they have nobody in their local area. I'm not sure where they go to have this amazing resource on the internet. And just quickly to segue into Corey's comment, because I think it warrants some clarification of what I was saying around guidance. What I found, having run 2 student groups, was that most of them came in fully programmed from the larger groups. The larger groups socialized and set the standard for activist thought and action. They squash innovation and critical thinking. And I think that, just a quick pitch, because I know Corey brought it up in one of our calls, this book was phenomenal and talks a lot about how the current movement just basically hands us all these materials, and that's basically how we think about so-called speciesism. And we're pinned into this framework. So this is AFCO's newest book. I highly recommend checking it out. That I agree. Like, we need to, I think you had a clarifying point around centralization. I don't mean a group telling others what to do. I'm more thinking a place for us to do what you just said, collaborate. And, there's a space for anyone to share what they've done and say, some of us may be web designers or, video editors and put footage out there, which I know takes a lot of time doing it myself. I think we can have centralization without a dictatorship model.
That place called the internet, though, Jeremy.
So what is this internet that you keep talking about?
It's
how do I get on this thing? I mean, if we wanted to do a live stream, how would we do that?
It was developed for the army apparently, and now it's linked out to the likes of me and you somehow.
Yeah, I mean, does that help clarify what your point around centralization? And I mean, do you think that perhaps guidance isn't the best choice of words, but I think we need a collaborative tool that is easily accessible but not easily controlled, if you will.
Well, you can have guidance in a kind of sense of collective reflexivity. In other words, everybody just talks to each other and they come up with ideas and kind of, and then somebody said, well, we're going to try this, and you go, okay, try that and get back to us. Did it work? Things will develop. Animal rights violations are not going away anytime soon. It's not as though we've got to do all this by next week. Otherwise, we could just shut everything down anyway. Unfortunately, we're in this for the long haul.
But then we couldn't hang out anymore, Roger. You'd start to miss me.
Yeah, right. I would, honestly. I want to put that on public record, folks, on the global internet, that I would very, very much miss Professor Hest here.
Yeah, maybe we can hear some thoughts in the comments. I mean, maybe where do you go on the internet we probably have a lot of organizers or activists on the chat with us right now. I mean, where would you go on the internet, or where would you recommend people go maybe to get more information? I mean, I think there is a lot of it out there.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Wouldn't you say, look, I want to find this, I'm looking for that. It's just the same as, if you want to find a vegan caviar, you put it on the internet and somebody tells you where it is. So, I don't think that's necessarily a problem. But also, if that kind of a resource is absent, then yeah, we probably need to create it. But it's not as though that's beyond our capabilities either. And then the first thing to do would be to contact the people who are already kind of doing it in some form, and they could explain how did they set it up, how did it go, all the rest, and then we can learn from their mistakes even, and maybe do a bit of shortcut, or we don't do this, do that. We could learn just by having discourse and dialogue amongst the organizers in order to grow and facilitate. And then once people are really in the kind of swing of it, then they can delegate, if you like. That's the wrong word, I know, sorry about that. They can kind of encourage others to branch out, and then go, okay, well, we're doing this. Well, you could do this in your local area. I mean, Ronnie's ideal type is to have vegan events going on everywhere, not just in the big city centers, but in.
And by event, clarifying, we're not talking about demos. We're literally talking about more the festival model.
No, anything.
Okay, just event in general, just an umbrella term. Okay.
Yeah. So I mean, like, really, the idea is not to tell people what to do; it's enable them to do what they want to do.
Right, and inspire them, to Corey's point, to continue that critical thinking and thinking of new ideas versus mimicking the.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, Corey mentions the lack of critical thinking. Well, it is true. We need to inspire them to think. And one of the things that stops them thinking is the fact that eventually, within 5 minutes, they think, well, I wouldn't be able to afford this anyway. I've seen that so many times. Yeah.
I mean, I think there's obviously a lot to unpack with this. It sounds like we're saying something very similar. I think we want to see that collaboration. I just don't necessarily think it's happening at the moment on the scale we need it to be happening. And the I word, the internet, I think it's there. I think it's just not necessarily being, connecting in the way that it could. I mean, yeah. Actually, the start of the Animal Rights Show was a collaborative Facebook Messenger chat that just kind of grew from there. And I think those types of things, I actually started one for outreach and another one for collaborating on creating vegan content specifically for social media. So anyone feel free to message me if you want to be added to those.
Yeah, it's true. It's true, Jeremy. But like it's that's just the way it was. But at the moment, the internet is being used to support either the national group structure, which funnels money into them, or now it's being used to create and support these figurehead people. And all of it is really saying to the civilians, we'll do it. Support us. We'll do it. The idea is there's a problem here. Let's do it. Let's all do it. Let's solve it. Let's do it. This is a community thing. One citizen talking to others, one citizen organizing with others to get something going, sabbing, direct action, whatever they want to do. But it needs to be done. It's like a can-do situation, not a can-donate situation. Hey, that's a good slogan, isn't it?
I was just gonna say.
Yeah.
So it's almost like he planned it, but that just came out, didn't it? Well, I think Elliot has a little bit of a correction here. He says that, or Elliot says that you could still hang out, and that they remember you saying that when you're younger, that they asked you to come to a party, and that you said you would come once rights had stopped being violated. So it sounds like you and I can party and hang out once this whole thing's over. Once, like you say, we just start doing it instead of donating. Yeah,
we've got a lot of work to do first before we have a party. I'll tell you that.
So don't book it in. Well, yeah, with social distancing or physical distancing, we've got some time anyway. So
yeah, don't put the vegan sausage rolls in the oven just yet.
All right. Well, I think we've just scratched the surface here, but let's keep the conversation going. I think I know it's gotten me thinking more about kind of how that structure could work. I know it sounds like you're working with Ronnie on a currently new idea to try to create that connection and that network. Do it versus donate. Do you have any other closing words other than that?
I don't think I can top that though, could I really?
I should have hit the stop button right there, shouldn't I have? Go out dramatically.
Yeah. Yes, right. Do it and don't donate.
Well, with that, thank you everybody for joining us, and see us on Sunday for our 20th episode of the Animal Rights Show.
But sorry, Tom.
What was that you were saying, Roger? Rhubarb. I have an announcement to make. Welcome to our 20th show.
Woo!
Officially number 20 since April.
Oh, I've got to do this again. Yeah, number 20.
Count. Yeah, you have to have your fingers and toes to count that one, don't you?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, it's difficult. My feet are freezing now.
If you are just joining us, please let us know you're here in the comments. We always try to work in as many comments as we can. We've got an action-packed show, I think, starting this week. We have a brand new segment to introduce, and I think may as well just get on with it. Let's see here. It's time for the language liberation of the week. So we're super excited about this week's new segment because I think for a lot of us, language is close to our hearts. And I know for me, I've started to be more and more aware of how it's used both to promote disrespect for other animals, but I think it can also be used as a tool to help liberate them. And so the whole idea is to, liberate others. We have to first liberate ourselves from the language. And I think one that is a very strong point for all of us is not referring to other animals as it. So if you are in the comments now and you're familiar with other non-vegans, but also animal advocates referring to other animals as it, please let us know, because I know for me, I've noticed it to be quite a widespread phenomenon, even amongst experienced advocates. And I think we often on the show talk about all kinds of nuances with language, but to me, this is the fundamental. And I would propose maybe 3 alternatives for it. I think other animals is probably the most versatile. I've started to incorporate our fellow animals to start positioning their relationship to us, but then also not having to fully depend on that, and also allow some room to that for them to have moral value separate to that relation to us. And then another very versatile thing, even when we don't know the gender, is referring to other animals as she or her. I think it's quite a powerful way to do it, because people often default to he, him. So I think to just kind of mix it up a little bit, and a little subtle nod to dismantling the patriarchy. So hello, Gaspar, Jennifer, and Kristen, my mom, back again. Great to see everyone.
Who's waving, apparently.
Oh, hello.
Hello.
Jennifer.
Hello. It is our 20th show, so it's a landmark, but plenty more where that came from. So what do we think? Alternatives to it? I think you had some thoughts around language in general, Roger. I don't know if you want to chuck those in there.
Well, it's a general sociological point, which is that sociologists see social movements as claims makers in civil society, and so all social movements are really careful about the way that they express their values and they articulate themselves. You know, in terms of kind of teaching social movement theory, the classic case is the feminist movement. You know, that they changed language and then made it political, because, of course, going back to the idea of grammatically, it's probably correct in the same way as people often call human infants it, which again is grammatically correct. But when you challenge that from our point of view, an anti-speciesist point of view, we're doing something political. It's not a question of whether it is grammatical or not.
Yeah, kind of the moral versus the grammatical. And it looks like Sarah, as well as looks like we have a meeting of the moms. Tom's mom's here as well.
Hello. Hi, Tom.
Is there anybody here that's not a relative of one of the panelists?
We talk about breaking out of the vegan bubble, trying to break out of the family bubble. Well, I think probably one of the hardest things is if we do hear, I mean, I think there's lots of examples, but if we do hear someone referring to other animals as it, how do we navigate that? I mean, I think if we just, every time we saw it, either, especially I think on social media text threads, it's quite challenging because people can get defensive with it. But even in person, I mean, I think a common tactic is to use the language we'd prefer and hope that they kind of pick up on the difference. But I think that oftentimes gets missed. So, I mean, I don't know if anybody else has had any experience with that, saying, you know, actually, I don't know if you realize, but, you know, when we refer to other animals as it, we're suggesting that there's something, not someone, or, you know, something along those lines.
I did that for years on social media, literally years, just saying, you know, polite notice, please don't call other animals it. And a lot of people reacted very kind of, oh, blimey, I didn't even realize. But other people reacted really kind of with hostility, you know, oh, thank you, vegan police, you know, that kind of stuff. So you do get a variety of responses if you do make the point, even if you're trying to make it as diplomatically as you can. It still doesn't necessarily go down too well sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's the tricky bit, isn't it? Trying to get that balance between raising awareness and not being the vegan police, and it's quite a tricky balance. And sometimes I find myself hearing it and just feeling like, oh, I don't feel this is quite the situation to bring that up. You know, it can be very difficult. And other times you do, and it doesn't get met very well. And just generally on language as well, I think it's important to remember that we don't know what we don't know. So sometimes until it is brought to our awareness, we'll be very unconscious about it. And if we think stages of learning, so we have unconscious incompetence first, which is when you don't know what you don't know, and that's you're not sure about what you're actually saying. Is that a known
unknown, or an unknown unknown?
An unknown unknown. Yeah, exactly that. And then you go through so once you have the awareness, then you have the conscious incompetence. So although you might be aware of it, you might still then use the language because it's so ingrained in your habits and your conditioning. And so then what you need to do then is practice it. And this is where hopefully we can practice using that language ourselves, so that we can break expectations, and by doing that create opportunities to explain what and why we're doing it. And we then move into the next, that is our conscious competence, is the practice, because we're consciously using it. And then hopefully we move into the unconscious competence, where we're using it automatically, where we don't have to think about it anymore, so it becomes part of our habits. So we have to move through those stages. So and sometimes I think we can catch ourselves using it or hear other people, even though they might be aware, they might be in one of those stages of learning where they haven't practiced it enough yet to
I bet you everybody's had this experience, that if people get a bit riled up, that's when they might do it. And otherwise they might be quite careful with their language, and then if a heated conversation starts, I'm talking about actually a verbal one, then that's where it all might go. It's a little bit like ableism. I mean, what we're learning sociologically is that these oppressive forms are embedded into the culture of society, and so it's actually hard to navigate them, and you've got to kind of be aware of it, and you've got to think about it. And that's what a lot of people then who are kind of anti-PC are kind of almost like, oh, I don't have time for this. Well, of course, everybody should have time to try and reduce the amount of hurt that you're creating someone else. And also, our task in terms of a social movement is inherently political. So to say we don't have time for that, it doesn't really make any sense in a social movement context in the first place.
I think, and the good thing, touching on what Jeremy said, is there's a broad range of words that would work. I mean, Jeremy, you listed quite a few examples there. I tend to sometimes use different words depending on the context. Recently, I started using they, because that can still work in a singular context, even though some people who I've debated this with say, oh, you can't use that for plural. But if we didn't know the gender or how someone wanted to be referred to as a human, we would still say they as a reference point. So, but yeah, I think by not doing it, we're devaluing the strength of our arguments, and we're kind of denying the individuality of the other animals who we're advocating for. Just weakens the advocacy, I think.
Yeah, do you know what I've noticed? In fact, for some, not quite sure why, particularly at the moment, but I've noticed a lot of people saying fish instead of fishes. And again, fish is grammatically okay. It's just that fishes is much more political. And especially as animal advocates and vegans, we know that the individuality of fishes is always being compromised. They don't even count the ones that they kill. They just weigh them. That's how much we don't care about fishes being individuals. And so even more than anything else, saying fishes rather than fish, I mean, I saw a video and it said fish is someone or something like that. It was kind of a weird statement. Whereas if it was, a fish is someone or fishes are someone's, that would make sense. But fish is someone didn't make any sense within this context.
I quite like a fish, because even though fishes is correct when you're dealing with multiple kinds of fishes, a fish just navigates around that, I think, and still focuses on the individual. And that's being echoed in the comments here. I mean, I think Jennifer's got a good point around how to kind of highlight it without it bringing up people's defenses. Is actually just kind of a jokey way talking about how it kind of ruins, our argument to refer to other animals as it. And also just about how in different cultures, this is kind of to your point, Tom, if we don't know the gender, they, I think, is quite a good default, because I think I've had those discussions too, where people insist on the grammatical implications. And it's like, well, hang on a second. What's our priority, grammar or morality? And just echoing some of those things that, it really does imply that other animals are an object versus a living being, which is at the center of what we're trying to deconstruct. So if we're reinforcing that through our language, kind of setting ourselves up to fail from the start.
Is that a typo from Gaspard, the lake of it? Is that a typo? Or?
I don't know. Maybe they can clarify in the comments. I just take it to mean that, just in general, that it is seen as oppressive.
And
yeah, sorry, Nana, I cut you off.
Don't worry about it. Even if everything we say, we talk about, doesn't translate the same in all languages, the general idea is use for other animals the same kind of language you would use for a human individual and not for an object. And that may take different forms in different languages, languages, but that's the point of it.
Yeah, often people say that it's oh, there's so many more important things to be worrying about. Like that's literally a drop in the ocean. Hope that's not speciesist, but I'm sure it's not. You know, it's like the tip of the ice, the tip of the melting ice cap, or whatever. It's you know, that it's not important because it's so tiny. But actually, I think it's the other way around. It's like we have to take care of the small things in order to be better at the big things, and that it's the detail of things that really makes a network and a web of constructing, like Tom was saying. It will weaken our argument if we don't take care of the small things. And I always remember that rhyme. I don't know if people on here would recognize this. It goes back to when I was a kid, but it's that for the sake of the nail, and it is speciesist, I'm afraid, because it's the sake of the nail, the kingdom was lost, referring to a nail in the shoe from a violated horse who was being ridden for the kingdom and the battle. And but it was basically for the sake of the nail in the shoes of the horse, the whole kingdom was brought down. And I think that's really important to remember, that the small things are important.
And it seems like that's being echoed in a lot of comments. Welcome, let all be just. I mean, kind of underscoring that a fish or fishes as an alternative to the singular fish. And I think just words matter. That's quite a simple way to put it. And to me, the thing is, I think when people say, you know, I don't have the time, or it's just, you know, it's insignificant, it's the biggest thing we have access to changing. So why wouldn't we? You know, that's how we communicate our message. Yeah. And yeah.
Why wouldn't we? Is right. Going back to what Deb says there, words that matter. There is a documentary on YouTube called "A Cow at My Table," which features Tom Reagan. Actually, I think Pete sings in it as well. And one of the sections is called "Words Are Loaded Guns," I think, or "Words Are Weapons." One of those, because of course they are. And in the context of a social movement, we know that, and that's why all social movements tend to be very careful about the way that they frame things.
Yeah, if words are reflecting our beliefs and our systems in society, then we are, as social movement activists, we are here to challenge those belief systems and the systems of oppression. Then we have to challenge it from all angles. And I think language is another angle to chip away at those systems in any way we can, really.
Yeah, and those words as weapons can be used both ways, can it? So it's being aware of both sides, how we can use it, and also how we can defend, you know, not using it to undermine our cause. Well, with that, we have an exciting topic actually for this week that I think both from an advocacy perspective as well as an individual perspective, I think we've all had personal experience with, which is kind of a new segment this week. I'm not sure, is it a new segment? We'll introduce it as such. Yeah, it's a new segment. Let's go with that. It's time for the topic of the week.
I love that, man. I love that.
Just from this week at Friend Farm Animal Sanctuary. So.
Oh, so amazing. Yeah, so this week's topic of the week, TOTW, is all about vegan purity. So we thought that this was an important topic to explore, because firstly, we don't live in a vegan world, so it's impossible to be 100% pure. And as we all know, the use, oppression and violation of other animals is ubiquitous and so deeply ingrained in every part of our culturally speciesist society. And secondly, because of that, this affects all of us. And yet I feel it's something that we don't really discuss that openly. And I think perhaps one of the reasons for that is because there is a lot of shaming that goes on in the movement about how pure you are and how good a vegan you are. But I think, and if there's one thing that we avoid as humans, definitely it's being shamed, publicly shamed. It's one of the things we most abhor. But wouldn't it be better for the movement if instead of shame, we had an environment that supports, encourages and empowers us as vegans to become better vegans, to evolve and always be expanding in our veganism? But in order to do that, I think we have to have open, honest dialogue and with each other, and feel safe to do that as well, so that we don't feel bad about not being the perfect vegan, which of course is impossible in a non-vegan world, but just be sure we're doing our best every day and being open to taking steps. And then also knowing how we can support and empower others to do that as well. So we become allies and not bullies. So I think we felt this was an important thing to open up to.
Yeah, it's a big topic, both within the vegan community as well as just advocating, you know, when we'll get into that a bit later, I guess. But I think to me, it's kind of a similar thread to the language topic, because I think if people are open, we can have some really good dialogue. Because I think a lot of those Facebook threads, I think we've all seen of, you know, actually you're not vegan if you do that. It comes from a good place. It comes from a place of trying to advocate for other animals. However, obviously it's not always received that way, and can, you know, it can teeter into that kind of toxic space where it's just literally, like you say, shaming each other. It can be tough to read through a screen what people are thinking, though, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. And the question
there's
is,
loads of examples, isn't there? You know, do we take life-saving medication that's been tested on other animals, for example?
Yeah, and because there's quite a few areas that we could explore, I guess. And I think for all of them, whether it's medication, whether it's working in a company that doesn't align with your values, whether it's eating with non-vegans, I think the question I think we have to ask is, where do we set our boundaries? If it's not possible to be perfectly vegan and 100%, where do we put those boundaries? And do we draw those lines very rigidly, or do we have blurry lines in pencil that we're always kind of, you know, reassessing or assessing on a case-by-case basis as well? And I guess that's going to be different because we all have different, very individual situations and circumstances in each situation. So
there's another side of the purity coin to what Jeremy was saying, because obviously it's very uncomfortable, isn't it? You're not a vegan, all this kind of stuff. I had a debate about vegan purity with Paul Watson a couple of years ago, and I was kind of saying, well, you know, not everything can count as vegan, so you've got to have some kind of criteria, and sometimes in the movement, especially from the reducitarian strand of the movement, they use the word purity to be critical of those who are trying to be morally consistent. And so, you know, there are several uses of this word, and so it's then shaming if you're just trying to say, well, you know, that's, you know, let's try and be morally consistent here, so that rules out X or Y. You know, difficult. Oh, and thanks for I guess part there for yeah. So it's the Barthez thing.
Black versus lake. I kind of liked the lake idea. It sounded quite symbolic.
Yeah.
It's inflowing around in the middle of this lake that we have to navigate.
Very artistic.
Well, yeah, and Bob's raised the point around, seems the starting place for this discussion might be the difference, if we believe there is one, between animal rights purity and vegan purity. While AR activists are vegans, many vegans are not AR activists. Example, Gandhi, Singer, Reagan, and others that drove the concepts of animal consideration were not pure vegans. Obviously, I see a clear difference between vegan purity and animal rights purity. I guess that's maybe one that we all see a bit differently. I mean, I think, taking a step back, I think the word purity has been seen as a bit of a slur word, you know, like almost like the vegan police and that, when actually we should be seeking purity. I think the difference is we should be seeking it for ourselves, not dictating it to others. I mean, I think setting that end goal of veganism is really important. However, I think when we're advocating for veganism, it's a matter of people figuring out as individuals for themselves what that means. But to Roger's point, it has to mean something.
But isn't that phrase "pure vegans" interesting as well, though? In that, I mean, what is one of those?
Yeah.
And also, there is a bit of confusion around the definition and the word "practicable" in the definition, which is translated differently from every person. And I don't think that this means I went to a restaurant, they didn't have any vegan dishes, I had to eat the vegetarian one. This is not the meaning of practicable. I mean, there are some, let's say, guidelines to being vegan. Not everything is vegan, as Roger said. And not being vegan once every while, it's not being vegan in general. So when we refer to gray areas, we are not talking about this, what is convenient or easy or possible for us in our everyday lives.
I think Roger, I really agree with what you said there, Nella, as well. And I think Roger chose quite a powerful word, which is consistent. Actually, if we're, how do we be consistent ourselves every day? And I think as long as we're coming from that place of integrity within ourselves, and actually, like you said, Nella, practicable doesn't mean what's convenient. It means what's feasible and possible. So it is, if there isn't an option there for you to eat, there will be something. I know, because I've been there. I've eaten a pack of nuts and crisps for lunch. So there are feasible options, even when there might not be a vegan option. That doesn't mean that you go in and, I'll just have eggs today then, or I'll just have that with cheese in it. That doesn't mean that. It means, it's possible for you to have something to eat, or to walk away from that restaurant and have something else, or whatever it might be. It doesn't always mean, it's not convenient for me, or it just, in that moment I just decided, oh well, what the hell. Which brings up another point, actually, and I think we spoke about this briefly the other day, is I think it's going to be quite different from someone who's quite new as a vegan to someone who's maybe a more established vegan. Maybe there's a difference in, if someone's new and they perhaps been a vegan a couple of months, and they find themselves with someone's made them a dish with cheese in it, they might be more inclined to say, well, I was eating cheese only a month ago, therefore this is not, just for now I'll eat this. Whereas someone who's been vegan for maybe 10 years or more, or whatever, it might feel very different, and like, no, I haven't consumed that for a long, long time. There's no way that's gonna pass my lips, or whatever it might be. I think there's gonna be a different mindset on in those lengths of time.
Yeah, and I think that some of those themes are being echoed in the comments as well, as just the definition of vegan has been diluted. And my mom makes an excellent point, when thinking of pure meaning perfect, and perfect doesn't exist. I mean, I think when we look at the definition, which we had a whole discussion around that, which, could be a longer discussion, but I think if we specifically narrow in on that possible and practicable, it's really important to understand the difference between practical and practicable. That, like, an example I like to use is, this pencil is practical to write with, but it's not practicable to write with underwater. And I think it's good to be honest with ourselves that there are situations in this deeply specious society where it's not practicable to avoid the things we want to avoid. And we could come up with this list of examples, and happy to take some comments from the group too as well, if there's anything specifically we want to dive into. Those own individual boundaries, I think, is another strong point, because we don't want to make excuses, around eating vegetarian when we're traveling just because it's not convenient. But yeah, when we can, we do.
Yeah, it's building on what Nella and Wendy said, I was thinking back to one of the things I think that Mel Broughton said on not the last show he was on, but the first one, I think. We were talking about how the sad, sometimes you would have a bit of trail mixed or something, and that was about all, to eat all day. And since practicable means capable of being accomplished, if you go to that thing about, well, there's no vegan options in this particular restaurant, but then if you think, well, is it capable that I can survive the day, without giving into this particular restaurant limitations, as it were, that puts you in a different ball game. Then it just means that you have to put yourself out a bit more, I think, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was at an example, to give a real life example. I was at I did a hike a few days ago, and I went for a coffee with two of the other people on the hike, and they chose a place which had no plant milks. They selected a beverage with cow's milk. I said to the person there, is it okay if I go to the coffee shop across the road with another drink and drink with my friends, because there's nothing here for me to drink? And the person kind of acquiesced and said, okay, that's fine. I appreciate that might not be feasible in other situations. You may have people may be inclined to just not choose anything. That's how I managed to navigate that situation.
Also, I think sometimes sorry, Roger.
No, go ahead, Wendy.
It gives you an opportunity to make a point in those restaurants as well. So rather than giving in to those people and saying, oh, okay, then because it's not here, I'll give in to what you're offering me. It's making a stand and saying, actually, you're not giving me anything that I will eat, and so therefore I'm going to go somewhere else. I'm actually making a point of it, and so therefore you might have actually sowed a seed there, Tom, that coffee shop will now make sure they're going to get some plant milk in there. Do you know what I mean? So you're actually pushing the envelope all the time with these opportunities by not giving in and making a point of it. And actually we're stretching veganism rather than actually just going, you know, keeping it where it is. We have to keep pushing, and that's a good place to do it.
And also, when we act like that, we make clear that veganism is not a dietary choice. It's a moral thing, so it's a philosophy. So people will stop at some point. I hope that people will stop seeing veganism as a dietary choice that you can not follow.
And the other thing, I think the other thing that, I mean, we could easily talk for hours about gray areas. We, as a team, we came up with a list of about a dozen, and I think we have to tune it back a little bit because, you know, keeping it within reach for this segment, but also to what extent we eat with non-vegans, because I think I'm not alone in the feeling that, you know, oftentimes people say, oh, don't worry, you know, there's a vegan option for you. And it's like, actually, I don't care if I eat or not. I just don't want to be around that stuff. So it's where drawing lines that, you know, looking at non-vegan barbecues where they've got animal bodies out all over the place, you know, and some of those things.
Well, there's a dilemma that I've got at the moment, isn't it? I think the team know about this, and you certainly do, Jeremy. But I mean, what do the people in the chat think? I've been invited to take part in a TV show where they sit people down over a meal, and the people who are sat there over a meal are looking for common ground because they don't ostensibly agree on virtually everything. And of course, that means that I'm going to be expected to have a meal with a non-vegan in a kind of COVID-safe way. I don't know how that's going to work, but you know, part of me thinks I'm not actually going to do that, and another part thinks, well, it'd be quite good for people to see that, you know, vegans can be quite calm, rational, and reasonable, and answer the points and make a few points. You know, so I'm still kind of toing and froing on it, really, to be honest.
Is there an opportunity there, Roger, to actually say, I'm really willing to do this, I'm very interested, but it's very important to me that I'm not around non-vegan consumption? Is it possible that we would both have a non-vegan meal, a vegan meal, sorry? Is there a possibility to?
Yeah, I think that's a possibility, but then you think about what was the consequence of that request as well, in terms of, you know, how could they spin that kind of thing, you know?
Well, what kind of claim would we be making with it? Because I think it sends a strong message that we're opposed to something, doesn't it?
Yeah, but
it ties in with the Liberation Pledge, doesn't it? And yours is a unique situation because this obviously has a broad market. For me, when I look at it, it's selfishly a bit of self-care first, because I don't want to be around it. But I mean, in your example, you know, the opportunity to get the message out. So yeah, if you were given the opportunity, let us know in the chat. Would you eat with the non-vegans, or would you insist that the food's animal-free? Trying to get you an answer, but might not get it for you today, Roger.
We need a poll, Jeremy. We need a poll. The viewers.
Yeah, we need a poll.
Getting a whole lot of this.
Another situation that's often tricky, and I think we've all had to or still do navigate in lives as well, is work, jobs. And I remember working for a company a long time ago where it's quite upsetting even to think back now, but where the partners used to go shooting, and they used to arrange trips for grouse shooting and things like that. And as their main PA, I used to be expected to organize these trips, and it got to the point where I just refused, and I actually used to pass the work on to other secretaries and things like that, because it was so upsetting, and I obviously didn't want to be part of that. But then it's like, you know, you step back from not booking a shooting trip, but then you go into the fridge and there's calf food in there, or you're expected to go for lunch and you're eating with everyone else who's consuming violated other animals in there. And it's like, you know, again, going back to the boundaries, where do you draw the line? It's okay, so I can refuse not to book the trip, but I'm still a part of so many other violations, or I'm around so many other violations every single day. Or in the boardroom, it's the chairs are made from the skin of other animals. You know, do you even go and sit on those chairs? Do you? It's around us everywhere, isn't it? How do we even navigate this? It's very difficult. I'm so glad that I'm not working there anymore. But I know that people are working in these environments every single day and having to do things for work that is so misaligned with their values.
There's a famous case where Morrissey was supposed to be being interviewed by Russell Brand. Yeah, and he wouldn't sit on his sofa because it was made out of leather, which is kind of interesting because Morrissey was a vegetarian, probably still is at that time. One question about purity that interests me is in relation to investigations. I saw an activist talking about how, because they do investigations in slaughterhouses, they've got to do X, Y, and Z, you know, have selfies with the slaughterhouse, people be very friendly with them, and all that. And if you're in an investigation situation and you're kind of undercover, what goes on in the canteen? You know, and do you compromise that? Because I know I certainly couldn't do that, but I think some activists have done that, but also I do know that some of the famous undercovers, especially vivisection, for example, they were carried out by non-vegans, so they didn't have the canteen problem. If you're a vegan in a laboratory setting and you've got yourself a job as an animal technician, for example, and your job is to take the beagles back and forwards, etc., blah blah, transport the mice and rats around. So what do you do then in terms of meal times? Because obviously, if there's no point in suddenly getting your tofurkey out or whatever, because your cover might be blown on the first meal time, But that's a purity issue, isn't it?
That'd be difficult on multiple levels. I think probably the hardest thing is with these undercover investigations that slide to welfare, I think is very likely. But that's perhaps a topic for a future show, because we have good news, Roger. You've got some answers. So
hey.
Sweep is saying seize the opportunity. And Let All Be Just is saying that it's difficult. I'd want to make that statement and refuse to sit there with the violence. Alternatively, you can make a statement about not condoning it despite sitting there. Make sure they don't cut it. That's trouble with media, isn't it?
Well, yeah. I mean,
if only you would final cut with mainstream media, we'd be in a different place, maybe.
Yeah, they'll cut what they want, So it's also on Virgin Media, so that's Richard Branson's company. So what the ethics of that is? I mean, I wouldn't go on Sky, but I mean, is that much different from Virgin nowadays? I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, and talking also about living with non-vegans. And just a lot of kind of those gray areas, I think, are popping up through the chat. So this is definitely not an obscure thing. This is something, as animal advocates, we all have to face. Another one is working for a cat and dog rescue that fundraises for cooked animal flesh. And then, I've been there myself at a previous sanctuary where they literally would have pigs on the barbecue next to the pigs that were rescued. So it's
I've been very
bizarre world, isn't it?
I've been very lucky in that respect, to be honest, because the sanctuaries that I've known have been run by vegans, even right back to when is it, folks? Back to the 1980s. And Freshfield Animal Rescue in Liverpool, run by vegans, and obviously back in the daylight now, near Dublin, run by vegans. So I've not had that, the idea of an open day when suddenly they get the rashers or the bacon out, and to promote an animal sanctuary is not something I've ever had to negotiate, and I think that'd be very difficult.
You do hear about sanctuaries, doing things like selling the eggs from the resident chickens there and things like that, or having horse ride. I've heard of horse riding on the back of horses, should I say? And someone even mentioned therapy, using horses for therapy at sanctuaries and things like that. I know we had a conversation a long time ago, and it does.
Well, mentioning no names, there is a very famous, or at least a sanctuary run by somebody very, very famous in the movement that was caught by this idea of selling the eggs. And it's interesting because there's kind of you can make an interesting argument for and against on that. So that can be a pretty tricky one, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
Back to Wendy's point about working for companies that are not vegan. I think that most people, after a while, try to change jobs, or they find some kind of a solution. But we must not forget that there are individuals that are not privileged enough to do that. For example, in my previous job, they asked me to translate something that was called, it was a series of a TV series called Guns, Fishing and Hunting. And I refused to do so. And I was without a job. But I had the privilege, and I was lucky enough to be able to go and live with my sister for a while and not having to work. And I understand that many people are not that privileged, especially if they have families and children and I don't know, mortgages. So it's boundaries. It's a personal thing, and I know many people that feel guilty about the kind of work they do. Like working in cafes, for example, that they don't serve only vegan food and having to touch everything and serve everything.
There's basically no, what's the saying that you often say, Roger? There's no pure ground.
There's no pure land. Yeah, Andrew Lindsay said that.
Because I mean, you think about employers. I mean, even so-called vegan companies are oftentimes promoting welfare, which here at the Animal Rights Show, I think we'd struggle with. Yeah, it's a difficult one.
It happened to me when I was at university. I used to have lots and lots of part-time jobs, and I used to clean the floors at B&Q, and I used to clean a kind of car sales room. But also, I got a job cleaning the car park at QuickSave, which is, I suppose, that was an early British example of kind of Aldi and that kind of legal type thing. And it was called, their own brand was all just white, and it's called No Frills, because we had a football team and we called it No Frills. Anyway, my job was to clean the car park. And then there was a shortage of staff, so they asked me to work inside for a week. And I found myself then, kind of stocking freezers full of, body parts and stuff. And so I thought, I knew I was going to go back to the car park, but, and so it was a question of, well, for what, to make a stand for 1 week, it was a dilemma. Tell you another moral dilemma, which relates to animal sanctuaries, and again, mentioning no names. This interest where sometimes battery units will often start to involve animal sanctuaries in their business model. So, for example, they will, the animal sanctuary will buy spent hens from a battery unit and then distribute them around the country to people who have got backyard hens. And the problem there often is the fact that the people owning the battery unit are probably getting more per hen that way than if they sent them to slaughter. And so the actual sanctuary situation is being brought into their business model. And then you've got the, say vegans are promoting this thing, go and care for some of these hens who otherwise would have been killed, kind of things. So, it ends up being a bit of a kind of complex moral dilemma, because if you refuse to help the individuals, you're going to condemn them to death. At the same time, if you help them, you're helping a battery farmer pay for the next lot of chicks. So it's a real dilemma, that one.
It's always a tightrope walk, isn't it? Well, I think we've talked a lot. So go ahead, Wendy.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to ask you to put that comment back up, because I just, I think it was it Gerard?
Yes, it was there.
Gaspard, sorry, I thought I saw Gerard. I think that's a really important point that Gaspard makes, in that sometimes I think it's trying to get that balance between our own values and self-care, as you mentioned earlier, Jeremy, and also that balance between not isolating ourselves and getting that disconnection and alienation. I think it's trying to find our own individual balance with that, because the more we isolate ourselves from the non-vegan world, we can really shut ourselves into a bubble, but then we're not in the society that we want to affect change in. And sometimes it might be, but yet we still have to be true to ourselves and not make ourselves or bring harm to ourselves by being in misalignment with our values and creating that dissonance that we get, that cognitive dissonance of misaligned values and actions. And I think it's, again, negotiating our own boundaries all the time and being discerning and probably case by case. In this situation that Gaspard mentions, this person probably much more effective and productive at putting the vegan message out there by not isolating themselves away. So I think that can be an important point as well. And same with Roger's situation. Sorry, is like, where do you kind of, how strong do you hold on to those values if there's a bigger effect to have, like Roger breaking out of the vegan bubble with this TV show? It's very difficult. But sorry, Tom.
I was just going to say that to Roger's point, where he was working at QuickSave. Is it QuickSave? In the UK, with the recent legislation change, soon to come into change, with vegans being protected under the Equality Act as a philosophical belief, following the work from the UK-based activist Geordie, I've forgotten his surname, but I wonder if that will present opportunities for other vegans to push the boundaries in their places of work, to to refuse to do things or want to do things differently, which would align with their ethics. I don't know if it would work in that example, but certainly in other examples, of getting a uniform or something that was made from animals, a vegan would probably have the legal remit to say, I'm not gonna wear that. Give me a vegan replacement for that. It's interesting to see how that plays out though in the future.
That used to be a problem for vegan prisoners, although luckily they used to have plastic shoes in prison. So, there's a lot of worry about what if they're all leather, but they weren't in the end.
Probably a whole lot of cases like that going forward. And I think I've discussed a lot of practical situations already, I think, as individuals. I think possibly one of the hardest things is to do this when we're advocating to non-vegans and how to set that end goal of veganism when we're getting pushed back up against it, which brings us to our next segment. It's time for the objection of the week.
Hi there. So, this whole vegan thing, I mean, it's impossible to be 100% vegan. So, I mean, what's the point? I'm all for causing less harm, but, we can't be 100% vegan, surely.
No, you can't. That's true. And being vegan is not about being perfect. It's about doing your best to reduce suffering. And 3 times a day, when you have your meals, you have a choice to make. You can choose cruelty, or you can choose compassion and kindness.
Well, I understand. I mean, I like to choose meat from compassionate farming and higher welfare farming, and I try to limit the amount of choices that I make, that are certainly less cruel. So yeah, I'm all for that.
No, but cruelty is everywhere. Even when animals are free range, let's say, or humanely killed, cruelty is everywhere. They have to suffer. So choosing anything other than vegan doesn't help the animals.
Yeah, I mean, I see what. No,
Go ahead.
I see what you're saying, but sometimes it's just too difficult, and I think that I can, I'm certainly making less cruel choices, so I think I'm doing enough.
I don't think that there is less cruel. I mean, you choose cruelty or you choose kindness, and why choose anything else when you can choose kindness, when you can be kind?
Hi there. So yeah, this whole vegan thing, I mean, I've heard a lot about it, and I just think that it's impossible to be 100% vegan. I agree that causing less harm is great, and that's cool, but I just think, what's the point? I mean, you can't be 100% vegan, so why should we be vegan?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't disagree with that. It's not possible to be a pure vegan 100%. And the reason for that is because we're living in a non-vegan world, and our world is built upon the backs of other animals. So, you know, we violate their rights in everything we do, and we use their bodies for everything from our food, our clothing, entertainment, for sport, for breeding, for what we might call as pets, I would say animal companions. We're testing every product and medicine. But would you say that just because we can't be pure and do things perfectly, that we should do nothing? Would you say, is there anywhere else in your life that this applies?
I mean, I'm against other like human rights, you know, violations, and I try avoid contributing to that. So yeah, I would agree that for humans, for sure. But yeah, that's really upsetting that it's so systemic and widespread. I just don't know what I can do as a single person. Like, how can I actually even make a difference? Like the way you describe it, it's everywhere. And so,
yeah,
you know,
it is everywhere, and you're absolutely right. And if we do kind of consider the human rights aspects like you just mentioned, I mean, all social change starts somewhere, you know, whether it's the abolition of slavery or the civil rights movement, or you know, women's rights, gay rights, transgender rights, whatever human rights you might be thinking about. So, and for example, like, you know, we don't have a world where without raping and murdering humans, but does that mean because we can't eliminate all rape and murder that we shouldn't do our best? So I think the question is not, can I be a perfect vegan, but what can I do? And as with all these social justice movements that we just mentioned, you know, veganism, which is a social justice movement, is not about a diet. I just want to point that out as well. It's about respecting the rights of other individuals. So it's about asking ourselves each day, what can I do today to respect other individuals? And then ask that same question tomorrow, and then every other day going forward. So that's what it's about, really.
Okay, so I need to think more about the individual choices that I make and how that has an impact. Okay, I mean, it sounds like a lot of work, but you've certainly opened my mind to thinking about it more. Yeah, thank you.
Pleasure.
This has been the Objection of the Week.
That explains a lot.
Also,
We're back in the studio.
Yeah, and I think just to frame that up a little bit more, as you'll see, we did the common response and the rights-based response. And really, I think, I don't know what everybody else knows, but definitely on the first common response, the focus was on suffering, cruelty, kindness, compassion, all these things. Whereas on the rights-based response, it was really about respecting the individual. And I really like how you said, you know, asking ourselves that question today and then keeping asking ourselves that question every day, because I think that'll help navigate some of the situations we've been covering for the first half of the show.
Nella, did you have a list with cruelty and torture and love them?
No. Not really. I forgot mercy.
Well, you're going to bleeding.
Is it safe to uncover my ears now?
Well, Bob's made a good point around, I think you did this, Wendy, is talking about it not being a diet. I know Nell mentioned it earlier on in the group discussion, and really shifting away from it, because even though food's the focus, that's obviously not the entire scope of, be it veganism or animal rights, however we're framing the conversation.
Absolutely.
And maybe we can go through a couple of these other dilemmas that have come up in the comments, just around navigating a non-vegan existence. Is, you know,
that's a loaded question, that one.
Even terminology, infestation, is it our home or is it theirs? Yeah, exactly.
Can I just tell Jennifer something that happened to me this summer about that? Because Jennifer, you're right on my wavelength with that one. I had a similar situation this summer where one day, and it was the day, you know, there's a day I think where there are a lot of flying ants that are around, and they're not around for very long. Well, this particular day in my kitchen, all of a sudden, it was almost like one of those movies that you see, like one of my whole walls was covered in ants, all coming out of behind the fridge and literally everywhere. literally my whole day was spent with 2 bits of cardboard. So one was like, get the little ones on here, transfer them to here, transfer them to the garden. It took me about 8 hours. That's what I did with an ant infestation. I just
you were infested, were you, Wendy?
I was infested. But it was quite but I was so worried about them, and I just there's no way, and it was just then the little rogue ones that you just see a little rogue one wandering. It was like, quick, come and join your family, and I just
I'm trying to help you.
I just rehomed them all out into the garden, which was a big mission. But I understand that not many people would want to spend their Sunday doing that.
Here's one for vegan purity. I had a lot of flies. It was a particularly kind of bad fly problem, infestation, this summer. So I bought one of these, which is one of those old-fashioned fishing nets. I actually got quite good at catching them, actually. So it's kind of
creep up on them stealthily.
I should have filmed it, camera in one hand, and
Just to speak on that example, there was an incident where I live. I live in a block of flats in Guildford, and there was one of the residents drew attention to people in the committee, the residents committee, that there was a wasp nest, which they had located themselves in quite close to a number of the flats, and immediately they emailed the property manager person, and the reaction was, okay, we'll exterminate, called the exterminator. And I quickly did a bit of research online, and I from the research online that I did, the wasps, they, towards the end of the summer period, they'll gather food for the nest. But then towards the end of the summer period, they don't need as much food, but they still want to get the food, so they're very hungry. But so they're always buzzing around. But what happens is, if you wait until I think the autumn, like September, October, is that the queen will leave the nest and go somewhere else, and all the other wasps will follow. So you can wait to do anything. You just wait for them to leave, and then it can be sealed off. I raised this with the people in the committee, but they decided to go ahead and kill the nest. Primarily, I think it was because they were concerned that the wasps would attack small children who were there. But from my understanding, wasps only attack if they're provoked. So this is a kind of a speciesist stereotype of wasps that was kind of
more likely that the children would attack the wasps. The same way as we've all seen this, haven't we? Kids who try and stomp on pigeons in the street. Never understand that. You think, I blame the parents. But going back to
not just kids. I've had to tell off adults for throwing rocks at pigeons, seagulls and stuff on the water, and
rats with wings, vermin. It's interesting that. I mean, that's one of the categories thing, about socialization. But Tom, did you Google ants as well as wasps?
I didn't. No.
But I mean, isn't there a kind of I don't really know how an ant colony kind of works, whether there's some kind of as it were, prime movers leadership. I mean, is there a queen ant?
Yeah,
do ants have a private donor?
Well.
There are always solutions. I mean, if you look on the internet, there are herbs you can burn in the house if you have insects in the house, and then they go away without getting harmed. There are solutions if someone is willing to look into them.
There are even, that there are kind of vermin control people who have that as a job. Well, there are actually ethical versions of that as well. People who are out there with humane modes of kind of dealing with kind of these kind of issues as well. So there are people
presumably they don't have names like Rent-A-Kill.
No.
So do you know any of those then, Wendy?
I do. I know someone. There's a person that one of the sanctuaries that I go to, and he does it for a living. He's got a van. I'm trying to think of his company name, but I can find that out. And there's also someone else who gets recommended, who I think might be based in Scotland. I think he might be called Kevin. That's all I can remember. I know there were a couple of people who definitely...
Oh, it's easy to find. It's easy to find somebody in Scotland called Kevin, isn't it? Yeah.
Just maybe Scotland and ask for Kevin.
Ask if they've got an ant person, you know, with the ant music.
Adam Ant. I used to love Adam Ant.
Yeah,
I think another dilemma that Deb's brought up is, you know, single issue problem around puppy mill protesters aligning themselves with, quote, responsible breeders. So I mean, that's a lot to unpack around that. But Deb's also mentioned just the difference between kind of pleading welfare language versus actual rights language. I think that's what we're really trying to tease out during that objection segment, because I think another interesting thing is that I've noticed more and more is the movement oftentimes makes the claim of veganism being a choice. And I know I've moved away from that, because if it's a moral obligation, it shouldn't be, you know, if you choose it, great. You don't, fine. It's actually, you know, something we should be doing, full stop.
Interestingly, Jeremy, I think that you raise a good point there, because, you know, when, you know, people will, if you're in a situation, or, you know, someone's helping you in a supermarket, you're finding a product, and you look at the label and you say, well, they say, oh, that's not vegan. You can't have that. But in actual fact, I won't have that, because it's simply not an option that I'm prepared to entertain in that sense.
It's a strong point. But Bob's point there, Jeremy, is interesting. Yeah.
Talking about self-defense.
Yeah.
And it's obviously gets into the gray subjective area pretty quickly, but
yeah, Steve Best came up with this idea a few years ago called extensionist self-defense. So basically, if you knew down the road there was a vivisector, and then you knew that when they jumped in their car at 7:30 in the morning where they were going, by taking action against them before they got to work, as it were, would also be classed as a defense, because you're defending those that they're on the way to exploit and oppress. It gets very tricky, but it's a kind of nuance about self-defense, because of course, even in human rights theory, there is the concept of self-defense. If you've got somebody who won't respond to rational argument and they insist on attacking you, you can defend yourself even with lethal force if necessary, although you'll probably have to then go through a court case in order to find out the ins and outs of it. But you can do that, you know. So obviously, in terms of you know, it's a little bit like the mosquitoes and all that, the locust kind of problem, because if we can defend ourselves, to what extent is it legitimate to defend our food sources? And that would then mean, deer or deers, they're a problem as well, in the sense that their population tends to grow and grow and grow until there's a die-off. But during the time when the die-off is beginning, they become very hungry, and so that's when they're gonna, invade human spaces to find food, but like rogue foxes. There's lots of these kind of moral dilemmas.
Yeah, Bob's mentioned another one specifically around fire ants. So yeah, it's a lot of tricky ground to navigate. You touched on something I thought was quite good in the rights-based response, is the move towards discussing human rights, which I think as animal advocates I appreciate as a movement issue, perhaps, where we want to go with that. But I think it's quite a strong flip at the tested approach. Would we be talking about, I can't perfectly avoid human rights violations, so why even bother type thing? We do everything we possibly can. Obviously, within human rights, there's going to be challenging spaces too to navigate.
Yeah.
Well, 20th episode in the books. If we have any final words of wisdom, this is your chance to get it in there.
Can I just mention, because we forgot to mention it last week, was that we did a special podcast episode for my podcast Thrive Vegan World with the animal rights team. So if you want to catch up with that, it was a special for World Vegan Day, but as every day is World Vegan Day for us, yeah, if you want to catch that, it's a two-parter, but it's all around vegan issues and what we navigate as vegans. So catch that on, it's Thrive Vegan World, and you can catch that on all kind of podcast platforms.
Yeah, folks, if you haven't had enough of us of seeing us rabbiting away about things, you can actually hear us do it too.
With that, I guess we'll see everyone next week. Same place, same time. I hope everyone's keeping well in these uncertain times.
And then it'll be 21.
Just make sure you use the right finger.
What we're going to do when it's 20.
Yeah.
We haven't switched off the line button yet, Roger.
22.
22.
We'll see everyone next week. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Rob.
Hello, Earthlings. So this is another test, and what I'm going to do with this test is see if I can play along with the video and comment on it as I go, I think. So first thing to do is say, right, okay, so we're going to have a look at a video. Now, Peter Singer has complained bitterly that he's not an animal rights advocate, and here is an example of that, and I'll listen to this.
Before I answer the question, though, I want to make just one little pedantic point.
Absolutely.
Some of you just heard me say that if we take a rights approach to human rights, it becomes difficult to decide what set of human rights we have. Julie, you talked about animal rights there, and of course the same would apply to that. Do animals have rights? What rights they have? Although people very frequently describe me as an animal rights advocate, as you just did, and that's fine from the point of view of taking a political stance. People will know what side I'm on, where I am. Philosophically, I'm not an animal rights advocate because I don't think that rights is the appropriate terminology to think about the issue.
Okay, so there we go. That's Peter Singer, our father, as we often say. And so we have to get our head around this. It's not Peter Singer's fault. This, if anything, it's the animal rights movement's fault, insisting on calling Peter Singer animal rights, even though Peter Singer himself has said lots of times that he's not. Probably one of the worst transgressors in this line is PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. They've talked about animal liberation, the book from 1975, Peter Singer's book, as being the kind of Bible of the animal rights movement, but also they describe it as a animal rights philosophy book, which it's not, and Singer would never claim it to be. Going right back to when Singer published Animal Liberation in '75, with reviews complaining about, well, you didn't talk about this and you didn't talk about that, and he was going, look, the reason that I didn't talk about animal rights is that I'm not an animal rights person. And he even said that he regretted using the word rights in Animal Liberation. And also the further confusion is the fact that he starts talking about women's rights. So this has caused a great deal of confusion over the years. But to be fair to Peter Singer, he's never pretended to be an animal rights person. It's that the movement want him to be an animal rights person. In some sense, if you think about the difference between Peter Singer, Animal Liberation, Tom Reagan, the Case for Animal Rights, Peter Singer's Animal Liberation was much easier to sell. Also, it was 10 years earlier. Well, kind of 8 years earlier. So that kind of helped in a way. Singer got in there first, as it were. But Reagan's book is animal rights. But nobody in the animal rights movement, or very few people, would be able to tell you that. And very few people in the animal rights movement would be able to tell you the difference between Peter Singer and Tom Reagan, and why their positions differ, and why Reagan is animal rights and why Singer is not animal rights. They just wouldn't be able to do it. This is the philosophical mess of the movement. We've got a really, really confused movement, and it's almost like comical in a way, because if this was the human rights movement, then the lead author of the human rights movement, the lead philosopher, wouldn't believe in human rights. I mean, that's how weird it is, and then you've got somebody else involved marginalized by the human rights movement, who does believe in human rights, but as I said, marginalized by the movement. You know, it would just be really weird to have a human rights movement like that, and yet the animal rights movement is exactly like that, and that's why we're in such a philosophical mess, and why it's difficult for people. You know, Joey Armstrong, Earthling Ed, James Aspey, you can't blame them either. I mean, they came into an animal welfare movement, socialized into animal welfare norms and values, talk about cruelty, talk about mercy, talk about loving animals and this kind of stuff. And they weren't versed in animal rights. They call it animal rights, of course, but then that's the way it works in this movement. You know, you call what isn't animal rights, and that seems to get us by. Or you do the thing about animal rights widely defined, which means, you know, you can bring in the animal welfareists as well. Okay, so, you know, that's a fudge. You know, that wouldn't be too bad if people knew the constituent parts of what that meant, but of course they don't. It's a complete mess. You know, we've got a really, really messy movement in that sense. And of course, what it means for the rights-based people is that they never get a chance to put their case. The case for animal rights has never really been made. You know, the utilitarian welfarist case called animal rights is what is being made, and what we call animal rights, and it's a mess. Let's sort it out, folks. Network, which Janaway seemed to have something to do with the foundation of, or the expansion of. In fact, Movement for Compassionate Living once got a legacy of £80,000. Welcome. I've got a bit of a croaky voice today for some reason. Also, I've had an email from StreamYard, which is the platform that I'm streaming from, and they've got some technical issues. So I don't know whether that means that I'm gonna be a little bit jittery or what, but let's hope it doesn't get anything kind of worse than that. So people, thanks very much for tuning in. As the regulars will know, we're putting together an archive of interesting events and people, etc., from the history of the vegan or the animal movement. And today we've got the last, or at least one of the last, of the founding mothers, as I call them, the powerful women pioneers of the vegan social movement. So Kathleen Janaway will be meeting today, looking at her life and her work, which is all pretty impressive, as you'll see. So people, welcome then to the Vegan Time Tunnel.
That I think accelerating a trend to veganism is the most important thing we can do today to save all highly developed forms of life on this planet. We live at momentous times, at what could be a terrific turning point in evolution. Nothing, to my mind, can exaggerate the importance of veganism.
Yes, indeed. So that was Kathleen Janaway, as I'm sure you won't be surprised. I'm just going to knock a couple of things off here to try and help with the technological issues. So that film clip there, and there will be a later one of the same thing. It comes from 1992, and it was the 6th International Vegan Festival. And it's recently been enhanced by Andy Atkinson, our new famous filmmaker on the block. And so you need to go to his YouTube channel if you want to see all of it. Oh, hi, Corrie. Hello there. I'm glad you can make it. All right, let's see about this. Okay, so that is Not Your Mum, spelled the English way, M-U-M, but then there's a dot. So Not Your Mum dot, not your milk. That's it. And so that's the YouTube channel. So I think there's about 88 enhanced videos now, which have a better video quality, but in particular, there's a better audio quality. So it's well worth having a look, because we do realize in this day and age that if things are not particularly good in terms of production quality, then there can be a problem. We'll encounter that in a little while, in fact. Now, in the talk that I referenced there, Kathleen Janaway does talk about the importance of trees, which became, in the end, her main campaigning focus. And so this is when she switched from the Vegan Society to something called Movement for Compassionate Living, which is still online. You can still find their website. Okay, so Kathleen Janaway was born in 1915 and she died in 2003. She's very fondly remembered by a lot of people, including someone called David Graham, who is the co-founder of this, which is a journal, Growing Green International. It's kind of twice yearly, and it's published by the Vegan Organic Network, which Janaway seemed to have something to do with the foundation of, or the expansion of. In fact, Movement for Compassionate Living once got a legacy of £80,000, and the first thing they did was give £70,000 of it away to the Vegan Organic Network. They were trying to create a center, and their aim was to promote veganism, non-violence in farming, and a cooperative model for working. So David Graham writes this in an article called The Legacy of Kathleen Janaway. About 20 years ago, Jane and I, that's the co-founders of Vegan Organic Network, went to a meeting in an obscure hall in a back street in Glossop, Derbyshire. I can't remember the title of the talk, but I remember the speaker, Kathleen Janaway. There was nothing grey about her. He talks about Glossop being rather grey, and I've been through there often enough to know that that's true. Although she was friendly and warm, there was fire and challenge in her manner and her delivery. And as usual with Janaway, she draws together all the threads that was kind of really part of the pioneers' veganism at the time. So we're talking about themes about war and peace, injustice, social exclusion, cruelty, animal rights, hunger, and consumerism. I would throw in animal exploitation to kind of knock the edge off the cruelty bit, of course. He said her talk was informed, objective, but at the same time passionate and moving. She talked about how food was grown and how the slaughterhouse, a house of slaughter, is a symbol of repression. So that is kind of like really the stock kind of talk that Janaway would deliver, bringing all these themes together. So in that sense, quite impressively so. When she was the editor of The Vegan, the formal journal of the Vegan Society, she encouraged the development and publication of vegan views. So these pictures are some of the early ones, and then some of the later ones, if you like. And it really is interesting because there was a lot of argument in the Vegan Society because their first magazines looked very much like these ones on the left. And then they started to use photography, which was controversial at the time. And it seems like the Vegan Views have done that as well. So Vegan Views was kind of more informal than the official vegan journal. And it was designed really as a forum for discussion. It's obviously pre-internet. And so therefore, it was important to be able to produce these kind of newsletters, which essentially this was, with some news, kind of added in. I remember both the Vegan News and the Vegan Society magazine, of course, in the radical bookshops of the 1980s. So writing in vegan views then, at the time of Kathleen Janaway's death in 2003, Henry Mather wrote this. She married Jack Janaway. They shared a radical outlook and seeking a fairer, more caring world, and became conscientious objectors during the war. They were also Quakers. It was a successful partnership with Jack, although never prominent, was constant and reliable support in all of Kathleen's work. During the war, whilst she was preparing a meager ration of lamb, bunny rabbit ears, Kathleen heard a commotion outside and saw lambs in the field, and in fact, a slaughterhouse truck too. They both suddenly made the connection and became vegetarians. In 1964, Kathleen read a review of the book Animal Machines by Ruth Harris. She then made the connection between milk production and the need to slaughter superfluous male calves. Once she became a vegan, in 1971, having raised 3 children, she took over as secretary of the Vegan Society and dedicated her mind and energy to the vegan cause. So even with these tributes, we can see that Kathleen Janaway's life and her work was very important in terms of the history of the vegan social movement. So as I said above then, she was born in 1915 and died in 2003 at the age of 87. She had working class origins, and it was these working class values of her parents and grandparents that were to shape her radical vision of the future, and that future for her eventually meant a vegan future. So she campaigned first for the Vegan Society as its general secretary and editor of the magazine. That was from the 1970s, and then from 84 onwards was a co-founder of the Movement for Compassionate Living that I mentioned before, and as I said, is still up online. I think the actual base of that is now in Wales, as far as I remember. She left the Vegan Society, and there's some controversy about how and why, but she left really because she wanted to concentrate on ecological veganism, it was called at the time. And if you watch the film I mentioned at the beginning all the way through, you'll see that she's basically saying that's what she wanted to concentrate on. But she didn't want to do it within the Vegan Society. She said that she respected their kind of focus on animal issues as the focus and then other issues as the scope. But she wanted to focus on the scope part of it, if that makes sense. So so that's how she kind of went from the one organization to the other. She was born into a very poor family. She remembers, for example, as a child, having to go to bed early on some days because the gas would run out. And so she was born into poverty. Her father was a speaker for the Socialist Party of Britain, which later became the British Labour Party. And he would give talks on peace and also the dignity of the working class. Her grandfather sounds like quite a character. He had unorthodox views and was said to be opposed to Kathleen joining the Girl Guides, which he thought were a bit repressive. They represent the status quo, he thought, apparently. So as a bright child, Kathleen Janaway won an educational scholarship to grammar school, which is the way it worked in those days. And in grammar school, she learned the value of critical thinking and the idea of questioning everything. However, she gave up an opportunity to go to university. It was offered, but she gave that up in order to financially support her family. She worked as a teacher instead. This was a plight of quite a lot of working class people in those days, is the fact that education and helping their family financially was often something that clashed, and so therefore they would often have to sacrifice their education, particularly for the women, sadly. But that was just kind of fairly standard within the working class. I hope I don't lose my voice again. She married her lifelong partner, Jack Janaway, just before the Second World War, and like Donald Watson, became a conscientious objector. I don't know why I lose my voice when I'm doing these time tunnels. This is the second time it's happened to me. I shall try to speak a little bit lower, see if that helps. So both Janaways and Watson had become conscientious objectors. During the war years, they both turned vegetarian when Kathleen saw slaughterhouse trucks arrived to take those lambs away that was mentioned before. But not yet vegan, she helped organize a protest meeting for the organization that was to become, in later years, Oxfam. And the protest was to demand that dried cow's milk was sent to children of allies in mainland Europe during the war. And then we get the move from vegetarianism to veganism. It was her keen ability to see connections between social justice issues that led them really to veganism. She taught children with learning difficulties. She was a peace and freedom from hunger campaigner and served for many years on the executive committee of the Gandhi Foundation. So everything was, as it were, coming together for her in terms of social justice. Then in 1964, the Observer newspaper in London published a 2-page review of this book, Animal Machines by Ruth Harrison. A 2-page review is absolutely extraordinary for those times and for now. And so I think she mentions that in the long version of the video from the beginning. So Harrison's new book at the time was called Animal Machines, the New Factory Farming Industry. This was really kind of new. It deeply shocked the entire nation, this book, the Janaways included. It revealed, for example, that calves are separated from their mothers to be sent to veal units in which they were tethered and not allowed solid food. And so Kathleen Janaway said that Animal Machines, the book, had knocked her for 6. It really did kind of surprise her. So I do have it here. And I just want to show you a couple of pictures, nothing too graphic. There is a chapter here called The New Factory Farming, a Pictorial Summary. So this is the first picture, as you can see. Okay, and so this is a depiction of a calf. Now, so there is what was then quite rare, but now is the usual thing. You know, a grain silo stood next to I mean, that looks like a broiler unit. Could be a pig unit, but pig units usually got brick bases. This one will be so-called poultry. So there is a couple of graphic pictures in this, so I won't show you any more. But the interesting part about it is that for the British audience, that will be the first time they'd ever seen anything like that. And so the shock that Kathleen Janaway expresses went around the nation in that sense. And that's what would have ended up being the prompt for a 2-page review of the book, which I imagine every author in the world would die for, I suppose. Kathleen says, it was at this point that I realized that these calves were the surplus of the dairy industry, and that milk, which nature intended for them, was being fed to us. Now, of course, that's a kind of fairly modern day thing to say, and we still say it. In fact, we've got a quote coming up from Kim Stallwood talking about how the arguments back then and the arguments now are essentially the same. I think sociologically, it's something to do with the fact that we tend not to identify as animals, and we don't identify as apes, of course, and we don't identify as mammals either. And so, although humans are mammals, and even although we might generally understand what lactation means, it's still surprising for a lot of people to learn that mother cows, also mammals, must be pregnant to give milk. And so you get the arguments about, oh, well, you can create milk without pregnancy, which is true, even in humans, but certainly not the kind of commercially required amount, which is why they go through that cycle of repeated pregnancy, and then they are pregnant and lactating. And so it's a very tough life for a dairy cow, and that's why she becomes so-called spent, as the industry say, in some short years, and then obviously sent to the slaughterhouse. So the Genoese decided then they would attempt to live without consuming calf food. She said it was the animal issue via her concerns for peace and world hunger that got her into all of this. So let me bring this back in. She said, my involvement in the animal movement developed out of these, in other words, interest in peace and world hunger, particularly when I began to make connections between the different issues. So these interconnections were very strong back in those days, and it also wasn't a problem in the movement as it is now. Later in life, she would become involved in something called Plant a Tree for Peace. It was a movement which was started by some of the vegans associated with the movement for compassionate living. But going back to 1964, Kathleen Janaway, just like most people, they'd not heard of the philosophy of veganism. They knew nothing of the existence of the vegan social movement, which was only 20 years old at the time. And so she was, you know, rather lost and quite isolated, like many of them were. And as an early vegan pioneer, she had the same fears that people like Donald Watson, Eva Batt, and Leslie Cross had held when they first went vegan. And that really was, is it possible or not to survive without any products derived from other animals? And we've got to remember again that when we say this, it seems odd now that it could be a concern, but everybody told them they would die without some products derived from other animals. And that included doctors, as I've said before, on different time tunnels. So there was a kind of lot against them in that sense. Now, although her account is rather disjointed, Victoria Moran, who's written a book called Compassion, the Ultimate Ethic, reports on a research trip that she took in 1981 to study vegans both in Ireland and in Britain. And amongst other vegan pioneers that she spoke to, Moran met Kathleen Janaway, who said that the earliest vegans didn't know if our bones would disintegrate or if we perish in a fortnight. So these are real kind of fears at the time, if you like. Eva Batt, as we've seen already, and she also went vegan in the 1950s. She said that she didn't know how she'd manage. She said, I knew people could live without meat, but without milk, no, I really thought I was going to die. And so some of them kind of internalized that message that they got from their vegetarian friends and from their doctors. Animal advocate and author Mark Gold suggested that some of the initial health fears about veganism had been dispelled by the time Janaway became the Vegan Society's General Secretary in the 1970s. So things moved on and things got better, as it were. The vegan social movement pioneers not only had a revolutionary vision of the future, but they were very brave trailblazers. So we owe them a great debt. I always said that when they got told that they were going to die, they said that we'll risk it for a vegan biscuit, which is what they did. And so they went for it, essentially. So by the 1970s, then, virtually all of the Vegan Society literature was written and typed up and produced by Kathleen and Jack Janaway. In a leaflet from 1972, it's clear that Kathleen understood the power of culture and of advertising. Writing, the chief, there is a warning really about the language. Obviously, people are a product of their time. I did get a YouTube comment saying that perhaps it needs to be de-chauvinized, the language, but you know, people are a product of their time, and I think people watching this will appreciate that. And so I've left the original language intact. The chief obstacle to man's survival on this overburdened planet lie in the minds of men. Most people find difficulty in adjusting to ideas that do not fit in with the habits and thought patterns of generations. This is very sociological, especially one, as with the feeding habits of the West, both producers and consumers are subject to the high-pressure salesmanship of the meat, dairy, and chemical industries. So there's quite an interesting mix of media sociology and appreciation of the power of socialization in there. Now, the Janaways were issuing warning about the environmental crisis, which became really key to them. But they started doing that from the early 1970s. Janaway pointed out, for example, that humanity was engaged in what she called an all-out assault on the living systems of the planet. And showing that she shared a similar radical vision to the pioneers of the movement from the 40s and 50s. This is in terms of their thoughts about the centrality of the moral evolution of humanity. She declared that, quote, the age of the new man is dawning, with the vegan being, quote, the prototype of the new man of the new age. Again, a little bit flowery perhaps, but that was a common idea that through veganism and through the adoption of the philosophy of veganism, a new type of humanity was possible and quite likely. And you'll see in the clip that's coming up say something very similar to that. So the Janaways' house became vegan headquarters in the 1970s. And I always mention this, it is ironically situated in an English town named Leatherhead, which is a great place to have a vegan headquarters. So Movement for Compassionate Living report this. Their house and garden became a venue attended by many over the years for meetings and garden parties to raise funds for the many concerns they were involved in. Now, Ronnie Lee, who became vegan in 1972, as many people will know, went to one of these, I believe, and he said he found it quite an interesting affair. Many will remember Kathleen and Jack's garden as the place where they came together each year with vegans from up and down the country. The meetings provided a opportunity for fellowship and being with kindred spirits, that kind of thing. And it was especially important for the more isolated vegans who could get together and meet people who had the same values as them. And also it was found to be a really good meeting place for vegan children, so they could kind of meet and play together and, you know, actually, as it were, not be weird for a while, I suppose. Mark Gold says that the Janaways' importance to the development and the evolution of the vegan social movement is absolutely huge. He says that Kathleen was all about linking the compassionate desire to avoid animal products with rational use of world food resources. And Gold states that over half-acre of garden was soon turned over to a horticultural experiment where she and Jack successfully developed green manure techniques. i.e. manure from plant sources only, food-bearing trees, vegetables, and fruit beds. Now, many will know that the Vegan Society was featured on a BBC community-based TV program in 1976. It was called Open Door. And reviewing this, Kim Stallwood, who himself went vegan in 1976, says to watch the show today is to be reminded how nearly 40 years on, many of the arguments made for veganism then remain the same today. That more people could be fed directly through plants and than through animal protein, thus alleviating world hunger. That consuming dairy products involved more rights violations against other animals than eating meat. That vegans lower their risk of contracting heart disease and cancers of the colon. That the vegan diet requires vitamin B12 supplementation, although this deficiency also occurs amongst many non-vegans. The latest from the doctors, as I understand it, is that everyone, regardless of their dietary choices, should take a B12 supplement after the age of 50. And that vegans are, according to one of the doctors interviewed, normal, healthy, happy people whom you couldn't distinguish from omnivores, except that they are slimmer and perhaps smile more. So if that's if you recognize yourself in those words, then all the better for it. Kathleen Janaway is featured at some length in this 76 program, proudly showing off green manure techniques. Now, the show, and Stallwood does comment on this too, the show looks very dated nowadays. Although Ronnie often says that when you hear it, it seems so kind of stiff, but it was the way people talked in those days, especially when they were on TV. But it looks so dated that vegan comedian Simon Amstel used sections of the original film in his mockumentary in 2017, which was called Carnage. And a lot of people can't tell the bits that he created from the bits that he just used because they were so kind of close to one another. Not least because in the 1976 film, there is a family, a vegan family featured, and they are Mr. and Mrs. Bland. And so I often think that there goes to show that, you know, people weren't very media savvy in those days, because I'm sure nowadays, if you've got a Mr. and Mrs. Bland in a vegan documentary, you'd say, can we just change your name for the duration? Because it doesn't look good. So the production values of this program are very low, but it should be remembered that what was going on was the BBC was giving their resources to NGOs and social movements to showcase their work. So it was essentially kind of, the BBC would turn up with all their technicians and their equipment and say, okay, what do you want to do? And so they would literally just film what these NGOs wanted. So I'm going to show you a little clip from it. Now, I did add some subtitles to it because I think it's probably going to be necessary. So let's see if we can get this going.
Kathleen Janaway, Secretary of the Vegan Society. Kathleen, some say that animal manures are necessary for the health of the soil.
I know people say so, but there's no real reason to back their statement, no research. Hundreds of gardens like my own grow excellent crops with no artificials, no animal manure, nothing except vegetable compost made from vegetable wastes. After all, animal manure is only plants passed through animals. I pass plants through my compost bins instead. All the inedible bits of fruits and vegetables go in layers in these bins. I cover them with layers of weeds. A thin of soil, and a sprinkling of herbal activator. And in 6 or 12 weeks, you get marvellous compost. That grows excellent crops. Last year, we had 200 weight of tomatoes in this garden, lots of beans, giant cucumbers, and many other crops, all grown from vegetable compost. Why use artificial fertilizers that can do damage to the soil's structure and life and cost irreplaceable fossil fuel to make? Why use animal manure when animals need so much land and work to support them, when you can get good crops with just vegetable waste, earthworms, bacteria that live in small bins? And as for doing it on a wider scale of the farm, why should it be more difficult than cutting grass for hay and silage? Anyway, if England turned vegan, we'd need so much less land to produce food. We'd have wide acres for forests and wildlife and recreation. At the moment, 90% of the agricultural land of England goes to support animals. If we are going to feed people, we have just got to stop breeding these pathetic creatures.
The Sahara Desert.
Yes, and so Jack went on to talk about the Sahara Desert. So they did all that composting and then immediately started talking about deserts, which was quite interesting. As I said, Andy has also enhanced that that documentary, so that's also on his YouTube channel. Not Your Mum, Not Your Milk, with a dot after mum, as I said. So Gold claims that some dismiss Kathleen Janaway as a crank. In fact, he's got a chapter. I think it's called Janaway Crank or Visionary, I think. And that was due to her utopian vision of the future, which, to be honest, was shared by most of the vegan pioneers. So let's bring the PowerPoint back. She looked forward with optimism towards a tree-based culture in which animal agriculture would be replaced by forests, providing food, a mitigating factor against climate change, which is always called global warming in those days, and preventing soil erosion. She wanted to see a global network of tree-based autonomous vegan villages replacing industrialized cities. So Janaway's tree-based vision of the future is indeed truly revolutionary. It would prevent monocropping, it would end unemployment and refertilize areas of desert. There was even talk about whether money would be abolished as part of Movement for Compassionate Living's vision of the future. She was big on things like bartering and swapping and community-based kind of cooperation, I suppose. She was also a great supporter of science, but argued that it had to be guided by compassion. The enormous power that humans have needs compassionate direction, she argued. She believed that humanity's moral development had fallen behind, and food is part of the reason. This again is echoing very much people like Leslie Cross and Eva Batt and Donald Watson. She argues that when parents tell their children that they must eat animal products and are punished if they don't, the child must in turn suppress their compassionate side. Interesting social psychology. On the other hand, veganism manifests a properly balanced human being, she believed. In 1986, Janaway wrote, "Freedom from dependence on the slaughterhouse nurtures faith in the possibility of creating a compassionate age." In terms of active campaigning and advocacy, she said that anger has its place. She also says that in that film that I keep referencing. But it should be an anger that is directed against the act rather than the actor. After all, she argues, you don't change cruel people with more hostility. She said that education is the key to spreading veganism, and this entails us taking the time to educate ourselves. She said that we must be aware that the present materialist, competitive, violent civilization, which has spread rapidly through the world, is not sustainable. We need, above all, a vision and hope of a practically based alternative. She also said, time is not on our side, and certainly the daily slaughter of other animals demands urgency in any rate. Once she had moved then to Movement for Compassionate Living, she developed these ideas of a tree-based culture much more fully. Through growing enough trees, she argued, we can satisfy nearly every human need, including that for food, and at the same time do much to restore and maintain planetary health. Adding, what is needed is a trend towards compassionate living the vegan way. In fact, that's the full title of the group, Movement for Compassionate Living the Vegan Way, with the emphasis on the use of trees and their products. Janaway warned that humans had created a second population explosion of deliberately bred other animals, competing with humans for diminishing resources, which adds to the creation of deserts, erosion, pollution, global warming, and ozone layer depletion. In terms of her position on interconnections, Janaway recognized that veganism must be central to our thinking. And again, echoing the views of the pioneers of the 40s and 50s, or the ones a little bit before her, she underscores their point that veganism represents the liberation of humans and other animals. And she also states that with great hope, she thinks that an era of true abundant living will dawn in which humans at peace with themselves, with each other, and with all living creatures will reach heights of creativity as yet unimagined. Okay, so let me drop this out. So that's your PowerPoint, and that's your time tunnel. It's my PowerPoint, your time tunnel, but I'm going to show you a last bit of a clip, which really kind of summarizes everything we've said so far. It's really quite impressive stuff, and I hope you enjoyed this one, and I'll see you again next week for another time tunnel with a less croaky voice, hopefully.
To doom's watch a little bit, but not for long, because actually I grow more and more optimistic. It seems clear to me that the age of predatory man is coming to an end. He is destroying not only the animals, but the whole planet and himself too. He cannot go on. And the alternative is the vegan way. Compassion to all life, all the animals, and also to the planet, the plants, and the humans. That's the only alternative. And it is our awesome responsibility to bear the task of introducing that alternative to the whole world. I feel that the change will only come when we get the masses of the people changing. It's no good just alone attacking the government. It's no good attacking the industrialists. The politicians will go on until they're frightened of losing the votes. The industrialists will go on until they won't sell their goods. It's the masses of people that we've got to get to, and we've got to raise their awareness. Global warming can be reversed and people better supplied with food and other necessities if we use land for trees and not animal farming. It's not the reform of animal farming we want. It's the end of it. And in a vegan world, as I think you know, there'd be so much less land required to feed people that there could be wide areas for wildlife where animals can live their own natural lives in their own natural ways, free of our interference. Perhaps they would realize that they no longer need to fear us. And we could sometimes have the privilege of making proper relationships with them. But the general picture now, I'm quite sure, is that the age of predatory man is coming to an end. Will a new age, in accordance with the teaching of the great, follow, or will we go right down, right back, and have to climb up the evolutionary tree again? We've all got a part to play in that. But I think generally it's hope. And if we can solve this problem of animal exploitation and spread veganism, we should also solve the problems of war and poverty and all the other things that has caused immense suffering to people and animals through the ages. Veganism is as important as that.
The movement's history is always on my mind, as you know, and so I thought, well, I'll do a little video about it, and then I thought, I'll do a live stream. I think this is only the second one I've ever done, just like this, just kind of me, as it were. So, hello, I suppose you can watch it afterwards. I think it gets recorded. So, yeah, the reason that I've been thinking about the history, I always do, really, but there's been three things which have really brought it back recently to my attention. One is a new book that's out, and that's about the Oxford Group, which is a very kind of important part of the history of the British movement, and internationally too, in the sense that that led up to the publication of Peter Singer's Animal Liberation. And so you've got, let me make sure I get the names right here. So you've got Robert Garner, who has written quite a few books on animal issues, and Yewande Okule, I think it is, so apologize if that's wrong. They put a book out which is called The Oxford Group and the Animal Rights Movement, and it's really quite an interesting account of you know, this lead up and this kind of coming together. People like Richard Ryder, Bridget Brophy is mentioned, but also the other people like Ross and Stanley Godlovich, who put together a book which is called, I'll have to look at my notes, hang on a second, Animals, Men and Morals from 1971. I would really like to get hold of that, but unfortunately, I've looked at it. It costs over $600 to get that book at the moment. But it is an interesting archive. I'm sure Kim Stall would have a copy. And so Kim Stall was the other reason why I thought I'd do this, in the sense that there's been two podcasts featuring Kim recently, which are really kind of fascinating. One is on our hen house. So I've put the links in the description, should be there, and also Knowing Animals, which was a recent one. In our hen house is an amazing story about the fact that Kim has got some footage of the 1990 march, which features Tom Reagan. And so if you look at what I've got there on the screen, then that's my blog site. And so you can see with that picture there, if you can see it, I know it's pretty small, but just by the just by here with the date, there is Tom Reagan, and it's said that the person next to him sporting a beard is Gary Francione. This is kind of when they were both getting on, as it were. What Kim is saying is that some footage, some reel-to-reel film footage was found about this march, and it was found in a dumpster, and so they brought it to Kim for archiving. Kim is almost like the official archiver of the movement now, so that's pretty interesting stuff. And so I thought, well, I'll just go through a few of the books that I have on the history of the movement, which might be quite interesting for people. The first one here is Against All Odds there. Now, the best way to get this, and you can get it free, is if you go to Talon Conspiracy. I'm not sure if it's .com, but if you put in Talon Conspiracy in Google, you'll find it, and it's a whole archive of of different things. And if you look down through the categories, you'll see the name Ronnie Lee, and you'll see the name Roger Yates, so you can have a look at things like that. This one is a sociological book about the history of the movement. It contains a couple of errors in a way, but it is quite interesting. So this is Jasper and Nelkin, the Animal Rights Crusade. That's quite an interesting book from a couple of sociologists. This one here is really interesting. This is Mark Gold, who used to work for Animal Aid, and it's called Animal Century. There's some really interesting things in there, including some kind of spotlighting of different people, like Kathleen Janaway and people like that. Also, Claire Druce, I think it's Claire. One of the people involved, there used to be a group, an animal welfare group for chickens called Chickens Lib, which is an interesting one. So that's featured in that book, Animal Century. This one is very, very important in the sense that it looks at the prominence of women in the movement, which is a big issue, and it's one that Carol Adams at the moment is talking about, in the sense that, you know, there's always this issue of you know, who are the voices that are the most prominent in a social movement. They tend to be male voices, and so that's obviously an issue, especially. Hi, Nikki. And also, speaking of male voices, very prominent, or used to be at least, Gary Francione. This is it's got some history in this book, Rain Without Thunder. This is 1996, and essentially Francione is kind of arguing about how, you know, a rights movement is kind of really a welfare movement, that kind of idea in that. Here's one from a professor of history, I think. And this is Harold Guthia, at least I always say it's Guthia, and it's called Animal Rights, the History and Scope of Radical Social Movement. It's very North American based, but that's quite interesting, that one. So that'll be an interesting book. You'll have to watch the recording and pause all these to get the titles. A couple more before I go, and I'll leave you to it. This is Keith Mann's From Dusk Till Dawn. So that really is an account of direct action in Britain, really. It's quite a big book, as you can see. Whoops, quite a big book, quite a read. This one is a smaller book, but it's by Ronnie Lee, the co-founder of the Animal Liberation Front, and so that one's kind of product placement again. Look, this is quite interesting, I think, in the sense that you know, Ronnie obviously talks about the beginning of the Band of Mercy and then the Animal Liberation Front, which was 1976, the same time as Kim Stallwood, I previously mentioned, went vegan. So there's quite a lot of interesting kind of history stuff that's going on at the moment. In one of the podcasts, Kim says that he was kind of looking at what some people were talking about, and they said, oh, well, we're looking back in our movement, you know, like the early 2000s, I'm saying, well, hang on a second. There's a heck of a lot of movement history before that, going all the way back into the 1800s. And you know, some of that documentation is really kind of quite interesting, especially the anti-vivisection movement. You know, I first met Kim. I've known Kim for quite a while. Did a podcast with him a few years ago. But I first met Kim when the BUAV, the British Union for the Abolition of Vivisection, it was radicalized around about 1981, I think it was. I became a committee member in 1982 for a year. But Kim was one of the staff there, and he really kind of helped radicalize the movement, really, in the sense that I think the magazine for the BUAV, BUAV is now called Cruelty Free International, I believe, but the BUAV is what we always remember from back then. And yeah, what was I going to say? Yeah, the magazine for the BUAV was called Animal Welfare at the time, and he changed it to The Liberator. And at first it was a bit of a glossy magazine, and then it became like a tabloid. It was kind of based on the Daily Mirror, really. And The Liberator was an absolutely marvelous document of the history of the British movement in particular. And you can see that again on the Talon Conspiracy website, which is really good. You know, you can also see a full set of this magazine called The Beast, which was really, really interesting. I've never seen anybody talk about The Beast anymore, but that was really, really an interesting kind of magazine. I was working for Ford's when that came out, and my job was to do certain things to the cars, you know, interfere with the cars as they came flying through, you know. And so I got so good at the job, which I first thought was impossible to do. I got so good at it that I had 12 seconds between cars. I used to read The Beast 12 seconds at a time, which was kind of a weird thing to do in a way. But so that's pretty good. So yeah, so Kim has done a lot now in terms of the movement's history, and that's kind of really what I wanted to highlight, because it's really, really kind of interesting. Let me see. Have you read all these good books, Roger? Yes, I have. Yes, I not only have them, I've read them, at least most of them. This one, the first one I showed you, is quite fascinating, because this is probably the only history, not only of the ALF, but of the NAL, the Northern Animal Liberation League, which I was involved in, and also some of the other ones. I think SEAL is mentioned in this, and CAL, that's Southeast Animal Liberation League, and CAL was the Central Animal Liberation League. So there's really quite interesting stuff. Goes from like 70, if I can show you that, goes from 72 to 86. So it's really, really interesting stuff. And as I said, the full text, the whole of this book, is available on the Talon website, Talon Conspiracy. I think it might be .com, but you can easily kind of Google that and find it. We're hoping that Robert Garner, the main author of the book about the Oxford group, will appear on the Animal Rights Show. And speaking of the Animal Rights Show, we did a nice show about Tom Reagan yesterday, and we've got part 2 coming up next week on Monday at 6 p.m. British and Irish time. And we should hopefully have a pretty nice announcement to make about that particular show. It's not finalized yet, but I'll let you know, well, when I know, I guess. So, okay, well, that's all I really wanted to say. So unless anyone's got any other questions, I shall sign off. And as I said, this is only the second time I've ever done one of these, so it's all a bit weird, but interesting nevertheless. So I'm going to say goodbye now, folks, and you take care. Bye, Earthlings.